Hundreds of years ago, monsters mysteriously began to appear in the world, and their destructive raids destroyed a huge number of megacities and ordinary cities. The few survivors were forced to lock themselves up in very well-defended fortresses, spending their entire lives in isolation, so that this very life would not be lost. The story began in Fortress Number 54, where a siren screamed throughout the area, warning local residents to stay away from strange crevices at all costs. If any poor wretch were to fall into this huge circular pit, he would at best be bruised, and at worst, fall right into the center of the underground creature's lair. A certain girl, however, was not up to it, because she was about to be abused right now, and even accused of not appreciating the honor shown to her. Oh yes, she should thank all the possible gods that Brother Kai himself chose to honor her with his seed, and that he allowed such a beggar to study at the academy with decent people. The head of these scum calmly added that the student has exactly two options for action: either give herself up to them for abuse, or jump into the abyss behind her back. Sobbing with horror and rage, the woman shouted that they were all just rotten bastards, and that she would never let someone like them touch her. And Kai, with a bloodthirsty grin, imagined throwing a completely different woman into this pit to her death, before hinting that the current victim didn't know everything. He has already won. He has thrown the brother of a certain Lin Ling into prison, and now this unfortunate woman has no choice but to go down the aisle with him, otherwise her sibling will die. But for now, you cannot think about the future spouse. Instead, Kai stepped forward with an evil and lustful expression on his face, and the unfortunate woman almost fainted from fear. And she really had nowhere to run. Right behind her was a chasm so deep that it was impossible to see the bottom in daylight. It was like a huge, wide-open throat, and it seemed to whisper at the edge of perception to make the student decide to take a deadly leap. It would seem that this would be the end of it. But then the rapists stopped and listened, because they also heard some strange sounds from this pit. A few moments later, a huge, ugly monster appeared out of it, very much resembling the Venom symbiote, except that the long, wriggling tongue was missing. The young brat almost wet himself at the sight of it, because it wasn't some overgrown gorilla. It was the bone-faced beast itself, a B-class nightmare monster. The other teenagers were also shaking with terror, because the members of this category of monsters were not to be trifled with. They could even destroy awakened with careless ease. Needless to say, the gang didn't even try to help their leader. They had run away, while Kai begged them not to eat him, holding the student close to him. It wasn't a pathetic gesture of protection, of course not, but he would have preferred Beast to eat her instead of him, and her skin was soft and she tasted better overall. But instead of granting his wish, the monster stared straight into his eyes and gave him the most mocking, sharp-toothed grin imaginable. The big guy did not eat such human garbage. He just swung a huge arm, the size of a mining trolley, and then completely demolished half of the teenager's body. The fleeing punks found time to turn around and assess the situation. But when they saw the scene of the massacre of Kai, they screamed like slaughtered pigs and began to run even faster. One young man also took out his mobile phone and began to mumble in a slurred voice that, "There is a disgusting monster here. Please send help immediately." But no matter how fast the little men were with their short, thin legs, the giant with his gorilla build was many times faster. Beast managed to make just one jump in order not only to overtake its victims, but also to land on two of them with its feet, crushing them into a bloody mess. And then, with the same lightning speed, he snatched up the person on the phone, and with such force that the poor guy's eyeballs popped out of his head. The monster exulted and reveled in the violence, raining down a waterfall of blood and entrails on itself. And the student, watching this, could only sink to the ground from shock. It was at this point that the bone-faced beast turned to her, revealing that it did indeed have a long, tentacle-like tongue, which completed the symbiote's resemblance. She was already so scared that she decided not to even try to run away or bargain for her life. And being mauled by a monster was better than being the prey of lustful loutmen. She sat with her eyes closed for a while, humbly waiting for the terrible pain, before realizing that the huge demon was just passing by. He didn't even turn around to look at some small human female, but simply made another monumental leap, straight for the colossal circular crevasse. The creature didn't return to the ground. Instead, it leaped hundreds of meters until it landed on the roof of a building, leaving deep cracks in it. After that, the action moved to the walls of the very academy, which from the outside could even seem like a safe and decent institution. But inside, a rich gentleman was raging and raging, trying to get the answers out of everyone around him about how the hell his son could have died. What was wrong with their safety at all? The employees, who literally knelt down so that their asses were higher than their heads, groaned in humiliation that they had not recorded any underground monsters. "Do not beat them, Mr. Director. The monster must have somehow entered the academy grounds from the surface, but it's definitely not their fault, Mr. Headmaster. Don't kill them or fire them." In response, the man growled and demanded to stop fucking farting, because it was impossible. Bone-faced is dumber than birds. He didn't care what the slug's excuses were, but they didn't matter that much anyway. It was more important to catch the monster and get revenge for Kai. The academy staff once again knelt down, silently begging for mercy, but the headmaster was no longer interested in them. He had opened the hunt for the monster and was not going to let it get away. The demon itself, meanwhile, easily jumped over the roofs of houses, meeting no resistance from the locals. With the same success, it could have caught the wind. By this method, he reached a rock very similar to the famous American Mount Rushmore. Only instead of the pious faces of politicians, there were the faces of ugly monsters. On top of one of them, a young man with snow-white hair was standing with his hands in his pockets in a pretentious pose, and two other monsters were kneeling next to him. The returning bone-faced immediately knelt down on its own and let out a roar that translated into human languages meant, "I'm back, oh my master." His name was Yuan, and he noted with indifference that the giant was covered in blood and with the tail of the pursuers. So let him return to the monster space. Then he added that one of the other two beasts could also go to rest, and took out some maps from his pocket, which immediately engulfed the demons in dark smoke. Smiling in the most smug way possible, the teenager chirped that dear Wang Kai had thrown him in jail and become a piece of minced meat on the asphalt for it. And best of all, the bastard would never in his life even consider the possibility that the thing that killed him might be a loyal Yuan pet. In this world, power was held by people with various superpowers. But Lin pulled out a really fat jackpot, a deck of cards that allows you to search for a variety of monsters. Monsters and demons that could terrify entire armies were just puppets for this cultivator. Convenient and useful toys for various tasks. Turning to the last bone-faced character, the main character indifferently ordered him to take him to prison. With the greatest care, the giant placed his master on his huge and powerful rock-like shoulder, strained his legs and threw his body high and far into the air. Indifferently feeling the wind whistling in his ears, the protagonist thought that these three are the strongest fighters in his deck. They can tear even Awakened to pieces. But even that kind of power isn't enough to make someone in this miserable, dying world treat you with proper respect, Lin thought when he finally set foot on Earth. One snap of his fingers, like a well-learned magician's gesture, and the white-headed giant with red eyes also turned into a small, harmless map. There was no doubt that Yuan could have destroyed this entire puny prison, leaving only a pile of twisted stone. But he wanted a legal release. As for all the other matters, he was willing to entrust them to another monster, the map with which he had just pulled out of his pocket and thrown behind his back. The creature turned out to be some sort of demoness with spider-like features, ranging from the many identical eyes on her face to the distinctive limbs behind her back. After that, the action shifted to the building, the sign on which translated from Chinese as the Royal Palace. The same Ling, the protagonist's sister, was walking towards him, but her face was completely blank with worry and fear. So her friend tried to dissuade her with all her might and dragged her back by the hand. It was incredibly painful for this Ren Yu to hear how someone dear to her was going to sacrifice herself, and even consider it the only way out. As for him, from a woman's point of view, there really wasn't one. Because the Wang clan was dominant in Fortress 54, no one dared to even give them a sidelong glance. Kai's father was the headmaster of the academy that the rest of the elite youth attended, and his brother has superpowers and has already reached the 9th level. Nothing in the area will defeat them. She was about to mutter that she would have to give herself up to those dragons for her dear brother when she froze, her eyes bulging. What was happening inside was like a surreal circus, and Ren Yu almost lost her jaw on the ground as she shouted, "What the hell was going on here?" The entire interior was occupied by a huge, insanely expensive coffin containing the remains of Wang Kai. And around this box, like vultures, the rich were grouped. The inscription on the memorial plaque was touching, but it was spoiled by the fact that the photo was chosen poorly, as if the deceased wanted to beat everyone in this room. When the girls realized what exactly was happening here, they almost fell off their feet, because it would be easier to believe that the sky would fall to the ground than in the death of an untouchable prince. Ling didn't even try to pretend that she was sad about what had happened. On the contrary, she was completely openly glowing with happiness, glad that she didn't have to lie down under such a pig. She was about to turn around and quickly walk away to share this happy news with her little brother when a swaggering male voice stopped her. It was Senior Wang, who looked like a malevolent idol that had come to life, and he said icily that their marriage contract was still valid, even if the groom was now burning in hell. Lin very quickly became so scared and depressed that the only thing she could say in response was to ask if her brother would be free after this ordeal. The man made a very scary face and hissed that yes, one word from him and Yuan would be free, but the girl should stick to her promise. Ren couldn't stand it and took a step back. Because it all sounded like someone's sick fantasies, Kai died. What kind of wedding can there be a conversation about now? Curling his lips into a mad grin, the headmaster replied that his son would be lonely in the afterlife. And to avoid this, the woman would have to agree to a ghostly wedding. The red-haired student was even more shocked and wanted to explain to Wang that he was completely off the rails. But Ling once again repeated whether everything would be fine with her brother. The man also repeated for the third time that if she obeyed him and voluntarily killed herself, then yes, her beloved brother would be free to walk on all four sides. But if she refuses, her father and Yuan will be killed for Kai's premature passing away. So now the girl can only make a simple choice. Ren immediately grabbed her friend by the shoulder and tearfully shouted that all this was some crazy nonsense, and Ling should never agree to such a thing. However, she agreed that if she had to sacrifice herself to save her two relatives, then so be it. After that, the action shifted to a secret room, where one Wang man sat regally on a chair, while another knelt respectfully in front of him. The knee-deep guy turned out to be Yuan, The youngest scion of this rotten aristocratic family, a user of superpowers of the 9th level, he promised to kill all enemies in the name of the late sibling, and his father ordered to get rid of all members of the Lin family so that there would be no witnesses to their crimes. Junior Wang didn't object. On the contrary, he swore with a bloodthirsty grin that this bastard Yuan was destined to die in the dungeon very soon, and in Blackwater Prison something very strange was happening. All the cells that, in theory, should be closed with several locks were now empty and open. There were no more rules, restrictions, or laws here and now, and prisoners had the right to kill anyone, or they would have been the first to go under the knife. One of the prisoners with a maniacal expression croaked that they all knew what their goal was. Now all they had to do was beat him to death like some kind of animal. No one objected, because it was as natural for the locals to kill or torture someone as it was for them to relieve themselves behind the bushes. Led by a huge, bald, and muscular fat man, they all headed towards the same place to crush a certain pathetic ant. Lin Yuan sat indifferently on his bunk and read a book, not paying any attention to the warning that all the thugs from this hellhole were coming for his head. His cellmate, unable to even stand in one place because of the overwhelming excitement and fear, called for immediate escape while the cell doors remained open. The protagonist indifferently, without even taking his eyes off reading, asked why he was running away. And the second prisoner almost fell into hysteria, because it was like asking why to eat food. He appealed to the fact that the hero is so young and needs to save his future. But the teenager replied that if enemies can enter his cell, then they can take his life. Meanwhile, the mercenaries continued on their way, and they already had a variety of weapons in their hands, from steel tire irons to shimmering knives in the light. The distance had narrowed so much that the second prisoner could already hear their heavy, hoarse breathing, as if a huge pack of hungry dogs were heading for this place instead of people. But then, for some reason, the noise abruptly stopped, and the main character, having closed the book, calmly said that he would go and see what caused the parade to stop. The older man decided to join him, but what he saw in that corridor made his mouth open wide and his eyes bulge. All the criminals were just dumbfounded, as if they had attended a ballet lesson. But this was clearly happening in a completely unnatural way. They had all stepped into the spider demoness's web, and it was not only solid, but also extremely sharp, easily slicing through skin, meat, and bones. It didn't even take a few seconds before the entire crowd simply fell apart into small, bloodied pieces, flooding the floor with their innards. The unfortunate prisoner looked on as if he had been sent to one of the Naraka circles in his lifetime, and he shouted out who the hell the boy was. Putting his hands together in a pretentious pose, Lin replied in a brutal tone that he would not touch anyone as long as they did not touch him. But touch him with even a finger and you will be destroyed. The prison warden's office looked exactly as most people imagined. A huge, solid metal door with the most sinister appearance. Inside, however, it was much more luxurious, and a certain visitor was impatiently asking its owner if they would soon have the severed head of Yuan. Grinning nastily, this half-bald old man grunted that very soon this puny boy would be torn to pieces by the criminal authorities. The manager of the Wang clan's royal palace nodded happily, rubbing his sweaty hands together like a fly that had finally found the hottest and most fragrant pile of shit. Only Deputy Supervisor Bai Lin shifted uncomfortably from one foot to the other, rubbing her forearm and squeezing her curvy thighs, because she felt that something was coming. While the director of the prison was happily inhaling cigarette smoke, the manager, in a quiet panic, assumed that the released criminals were following them. Smiling so sweetly that you could have died of a diabetes attack, the old man reminded them that they were protected by the door of his office, which could not be knocked out even with the help of a tank. It's possible that the tank really couldn't do anything to it, but the colossal fist belonging to a high-level monster is quite capable. The warden's apparent nonchalance was completely removed, and as for the rest of the people, they didn't even try to hide the fact that they were scared. The door, meanwhile, flew off its hinges as if it had been hit with the force of thousands of tons, turning the impenetrable solid steel into a curved piece of metal. Boneface's beast was incredibly pleased, because he cleared the way for his master, and Lin himself, maintaining the same pathos pose, briefly greeted the audience. Attendant Wang, feeling his brain howling in hysteria, similarly screamed out loud that he would definitely report everything to his overlords. They must know. The main character didn't even look in his direction, but he didn't have to do anything. The demonic giant was already smashing the mustachioed man against the wall with his fist. Bai Lin watched the massacre with almost no change in expression, because let's be honest, she was much more concerned about the fact that such a strong monster was controlled by a human. The warden, meanwhile, jumped up from the table to remind him how important he was to the social system, and if someone touched him, the punishment would be terrible. Blackwater Prison had the strongest security, they could tear anyone apart. But the old man's face showed how little he believed in his own words. As for the young man, he just tilted his head lazily to one side, like a lion watching a hysterical pig, and then asked if he was talking about those guys. The Legion of Guards looked much the same as the special forces of various countries in the real world. They were distinguished only by helmets marked with the green letter X. They also all pointed their guns at their own superior without a word, causing him to stagger back with a cry of disbelief. Feeling his underpants sticking to his sweaty ass, the fat man shouted that he was their teacher, personally training everyone, so let them come to their senses. But it was useless. Not even because the main character somehow managed to outbid the guards, but because they were entwined with threads by an invisible spider. Yuan reported this information to the warden in the same nonchalant tone as if he was telling him that the weather would be clear tomorrow, or that it would rain on Thursday. This antagonist didn't have any pride, so he fell to his knees in true Chinese style, begging for his life and blaming the Wang clan for everything. To further torment and humiliate this bubble, the protagonist pointedly thought seriously before ordering him to hand over all supervisory rights. The old man did so immediately, but he honestly didn't understand why the hell Lin needed rights to everything on the prison grounds at all. The young man refused to explain because it was none of his damn business. And anyway, it was better for the fat man to remember all the prayers and all the merciful Buddhas he knew. Realizing that he was about to be shot by his own subordinates, like some pathetic deserter, the former warden shouted in rage and fear that he had been promised. Instead of answering, he received a charge of hundreds of bullets, each one hitting with such monstrous force that it tore huge chunks of flesh from the body of the executed man. Looking at his mangled, blood and shit-smelling corpse, the protagonist calmly added that he hadn't really promised to spare him in any way. He had some plans for this certificate of the position of chief, and then he handed it to Bai Lin with a smile, who was startled by the surprise. Looking at this small piece of metal as if it were an expensive and romantic rose, the woman asked in a low, hoarse whisper if they were going to kill her. The laws of the fortress allowed for such unexpected promotions, of course, but Yuan was no fool, and he wanted the guard to devour the spider egg. If she did, she would become his slave, a living meat puppet who would dutifully obey every order without asking questions. But the alternative was an immediate and very cruel death. So Bai, after some hesitation, decided that such a humiliating fate was better. The main character liked it very much and graciously promised that if Lin was still an obedient doll, he would spare her her own will. Bai decided to show how submissive and respectful she was by getting down on one knee and humbly admitting that their prison was now young master's property. Looking into his eyes with the gaze of a well-trained dog, she quietly asked what task the precious master would assign her first. As it turned out, a huge steel monster broke into the fortress 3 days ago. The defenders wounded it, but could not finish it off, and the military is now looking in vain for a way to finish it off. So Lin personally had to submit an application on behalf of her entire new prison, and at the same time carefully make sure that the fortress management approved it. Deep down, the woman thought it was crazy because Blackwater was a cardboard box for an S-rank monster, but she humbly agreed to help the master with everything. Turning away, and without even trying to take his hands out of his pockets, so as not to dispel his pretentious image, the teenager next ordered him to be taken outside. Bai was willing to do it, but hey, there were still Wangs outside. They would immediately send their level 9 assassin if they found out that Lin dared to stay alive. The main character just smiled at her out of the corners of his mouth, like an old man forced to listen to a child's babble, and laconically retorted that prison wasn't safe either. He was also not a snail or a turtle that hides in its shell when it hears a predator approaching, but instead preferred to raise the enemy on its horns first. The training hall for people who were lucky enough to gain thunder and lightning-related abilities was magnificent. It literally shone like a flash of electricity. However, the main character looked at him without the slightest respect and even with a hidden sneer, like an experienced but inconspicuous mercenary at the newcomers dressed up like roosters. The students recognized him at a glance. Even the hoodie didn't help, and they emphatically declared loudly that he was a coward for hiding here and not helping his sister. Someone suggested that the protagonist had come to beg for help from a certain Ning, but the second disciple noted with disdain that Yuan was late. Their senior had gone to the northern abyss. While the main character was walking, he was constantly being hit with judgmental comments that no one else wanted to help him. But the boy never looked back at them. There was a man inside with big round glasses, and he immediately noticed Lin's approach, and with excitement but respect, called him master. His name was Wei Xing. He was another ally of the protagonist. In particular, he helped him collect information about everything that seemed to be the wedding of his little sister. He complained that 3 of the total beacons had lost connection to the network, but Yuan only took out his maps and said that he would give other beacons in return. Under his will, the artifacts turned into a huge swarm of demonic insects. They had sharp mandibles like scissors blades and burning red eyes. Lin did not miss the opportunity to claim that there are legions of such kids in Blackwatch prison, but he, in great modesty, took quite a few. But it was still the opening of a peacock's tail, because as Wei pointed out, 3 insects would be enough for their task, and such a swarm can monitor half a fortress. Turning away, the main character noted that he had synced files and let Xing continue to do his work and stay connected. However, he didn't go far, because the bespectacled man, clenching his sweaty fists, asked Big Bro to remain as careful as possible. Wang Yan and his many friends will also come to the wedding, there is no doubt about it. And he, after all, is one of the awakened ones. He has a whole 9th level. Killing with Beast also caused a huge uproar, which caused the clan elders to make a fuss and protect the venue with an invulnerable barrier. Lin indifferently replied that he had a plan and continued walking, but Xing desperately added that they must survive as the only members of the resistance against Wang. 3 months ago, the blonde was spying on the now-deceased Kai and his cronies, and was almost caught by Spalishny. only saved by the protagonist's intervention. Someone else would have just said thank you and moved on with their business. But Wei saw this as a great sign and swore an oath to faithfully serve Yuan in his retribution to the vicious family. But the main character didn't care about all these sentimentalities. He decided to save the unfortunate photographer only because of common goals. And, to be honest, he would never have thought that a pervert who spied on female students would want to avenge the murder of one of them. The blonde man was not offended, but only repeated his vow to get justice. And then a huge armored car was shown driving across the wasteland. There was a government advisor in it, and the driver who managed the transport ventured to ask if he really wanted to attend such a ceremony. After all, it wasn't a normal wedding, and where did you ever see a living person being forced to marry a dead one? The councilman, toying with the red wine in his glass, scornfully remarked that some poor fool should thank heaven for having been so honored. The driver, trying to choose his words carefully in front of his boss, cautiously added that it was rumored that the bride was going to be killed at the end of the wedding. Another aristocrat did not even try to hide that this was so. On the contrary, he admitted with voluptuous anticipation that he would personally cut that girl's throat. The poor employee almost threw up in disgust and decided to remind him that the bone mask that killed Qi was still at large, but the bearded man ordered him to relax. The car they are in is a miracle of engineering, a fortress on wheels that can withstand the attacks of even tank monsters. They are completely safe. Needless to say, this was a colossal temptation of fate. And just a second later, Beast with a sharp-toothed grin crumpled the armor on the hood of the car with one hand. And then he screamed so loud that if there were any birds nearby, half of them would fly into the sky in terror, and half of them would collapse stunned. Frantic with terror, the driver shouted back that there it was, this vile monster, right in front of them. The councilman, sweating slightly, reminded them that they had an invulnerable protective shell that couldn't be completely destroyed, so let the servant just run over the brute. However, what the man didn't expect was that in a second, 2 more monsters with bone masks would attack their monster truck. After that, the rich, bearded bastard started yelling at the top of his lungs. Because, hey, the informant said that only one demon entered the fortress through all the barriers, and none of them had yet noticed the lone, boyish figure that stood on the top of a high, steep cliff and stared blankly at what was happening. Yuan looked so soulless, as if he had no emotions left for a long time, only a bare mind, and he did nothing but give commands to his monsters. While one of the bone faces swung its huge fist, the machine's system showed that hydraulic armor's performance was a full 100%. But when the big man started pounding on the transport at such a speed that it looked like he had dozens of hands, these figures immediately dropped to 70. And when 2 more monsters joined in, the much-vaunted impenetrable defense was quickly reduced to a single, pathetic percentage. A few seconds later, the car was simply torn into tiny pieces, as if someone had put tons of the most powerful explosives in it. The councilman was still alive, but Beast pulled him out of the wreckage and twisted his face in a way that looked like he was laughing derisively at his humiliation. It was difficult for the man to stay conscious, because he was too hard-pressed on the skull, but he could still see some kid walking towards him. Not recognizing Lin, the bearded man rasped out a plea with the last of his strength, promising the biggest and most valuable reward if only the stranger would save his life. In response, the teenager slowly pulled out the same dagger from under the rubble, partially opened it, and asked if it was needed for a ghost wedding. And for the first time, emotions showed on his face. The antagonist's eyes were red from bursting blood vessels, and he howled desperately, tearing at his vocal cords, begging for his life, but it was too late. The main character plunged the same dagger with such force that almost his head fell off his shoulders, and blood poured like a waterfall even on the back of the dead bastard. Such a shameful and frankly pathetic death happened to such a powerful and noble person who lived in this fortress, like a god among other people. However, the main character didn't have the time or inclination to gloat, because he immediately took out a new card and said that it was time for action for Shadow. This monster looked like a twisted cross between a human, lizard, and centipede, with its many limbs, crooked fingers, and stick-thin body. Grabbing onto the still fresh corpse, this monster used one of its mystical techniques, and for a moment, the entire area was enveloped in tentacles of living darkness. Even the creature's body began to change rapidly, completely enveloped in impenetrable darkness. Then the extra limbs disappeared. The body became shorter and stronger, and when the black fog completely cleared, the deceased councilman appeared in front of the main character, absolutely no different from the corpse that bled on the road. The wedding was decided not to be held in a Buddhist or Taoist temple, but in a huge Christian church, and the arriving guests were already gossiping about the upcoming celebration. Someone with admiration noted that the bride is incredibly beautiful, and someone bitterly retorted that it does not matter. She will still die, and all ordinary people are toys for rich people. The first gossip remembered that the killer of the late Jasper Lord Kai was still at large, and the search for special units had not borne any fruit. His opponent retorted that, firstly, Wang took care to make the venue of the ceremony the safest on Earth, and secondly, they invited the heroes. The universe simply couldn't ignore such a brazen temptation of fate, and just a few steps away from the gossips, a huge fireball fell from the sky. After that, the members of the 9th Abyss Squad descended from the clouds, beautiful as celestials, wearing light chrome armor and full of dignity. It also became clear that the previously mentioned fireball was actually the huge head of a ram-like monster that had just been finished off. A team member named Lightning turned to Wang Yan and coldly explained that this hefty piece of carrion was actually a wedding present. Gossips whispered that this was the celebrity who had almost reached awakening, and the older members of his clan promised him the area where the bride's father lived as a gift. The blonde man was glad to see his older companions anyway, because their presence guaranteed that the wedding ceremony would now go off like clockwork. A certain Master Yin chimed in, showing off his scarlet medallion with a modest smile and assuring everyone that any monster below S rank would fall to his magic. Team Observer. Yu licked his upper lips and whispered that he was completely observing the graveyard, and no monsters would pass by it without being noticed. A moment later, he noticed the creature's presence and raced after it, warning his companions that he could solve the problem in a minute or two. Yin mockingly admitted that this psychopath is very good at tracking demons with his mental powers, so the mysterious enemy will die very soon. One of the monstrous insects that the main character used to track what was happening was sitting on a power pole and received an electric shock. Looking at the small, steaming body with a truly insane grin, he croaked out that he was able to catch a really big fish today. From the activation of his ability, psychic tracking, the whole world has changed, gaining much brighter and more contrasting colors, as on the canvas of an avant-garde artist. In just a matter of seconds, he was able to locate Xing, and the latter was already cowering in horror, clearly realizing that his opponents had found him and were now going to punish him in a deadly way. The self-confident superhero, however, wasn't going to kill the poor pervert just yet. He was going to shake all the information about his master out of his head first. He quickly stopped and froze in midair because the entire world around him suddenly turned purple and purple, like when using a filter. His skin and flesh began to peel off, and he screamed in horror that someone had somehow managed to poison him, not physically, but spiritually. A second later, he crashed to the ground, smashing through the asphalt with his own head because his brain died, and the brave member of the heroic team became just a vegetable. For this small favor, Wei had to thank his bodyguard, a D-level monster called Soul Hall that resembled a creepy dementor. The blonde man admitted that his older brother was right. All these measures are excellent at destroying trackers, but just a little more and he won't need any disguise at all. Meanwhile, the antagonist did not even know how close their doom was, and continued to meet notable guests who arrived at the ceremony in expensive limousines. The monster disguised as a councilman grumbled angrily that Wang had lost all sense of honor by sending some pups to greet guests instead of the leader. To anyone else, Yuan would have had his head torn off for saying such a thing. But now he bowed down, begged for forgiveness, and assured that his dear father was simply overwhelmed with business. As the fake official walked into the depths of the palace, muttering that he wanted to meet the bride, the gossips continued to chatter like spring birds as they discussed what they had seen. In the main hall of the cemetery were the remaining members of the squad. Lightning was interested in when you will return, and his subordinates admitted that they have not yet received any news. The long-haired monster slayer simply ordered to find him as soon as possible and bring him back as soon as possible, and the rest of the heroes hurried to get down to business right away. One young man had only taken a few steps when the councilman suddenly turned to him, demanding to come closer, because he has a chilly aura. Han couldn't even believe his ears that he, a simple fighter and defender of the fortress, was suddenly called to him by the leader of one of the most powerful clans. The bearded man, narrowing his fiery orange eyes menacingly, ordered them to stop talking nonsense and come up to him, because he had business with this young man. Without taking his truly murderous gaze off the poor guy, the fake official reminded him in an iron voice that his safety should come first. This boy, and Yin, who joined him, tried to refuse as tactfully as possible, reminding that the bearded man did not have the authority to order them around. Curling his lip in disdain, the werewolf said that if he did, it would be very difficult for him to admit that these heroes truly deserve the title of Awakened. He will cut off any channels for their supply of resources, cut off all possible connections, leave them penniless, and all this in retaliation for this refusal. Zev watched this with much more interest than a circus performance because where else could you watch a confrontation of this level? On one side was the administrator with the most extensive powers, on the other, an incredibly elite autonomous military unit, and it was madness for anyone to quarrel with him. The atmosphere was heated to the limit, but Lightning, who appeared behind the backs of his subordinates and said that they would give in, helped defuse it without stupid puns. They would be the councilman's bodyguards. But if this man's gaze could throw real lightning, everyone present would be nothing but ashes and charred pits. No one could believe that the official was really ready to turn such a strong man against himself. But the bearded man didn't care. He only cared about today. Meanwhile, Senior Wang was in the depths of the palace and was adjusting his tie, instructively reminding about the rules of decency and behavior at the wedding celebration. Ling, however, didn't care about it at all. She just wanted her brother and father to be alive and well. Otherwise, she would get out of Naraka and torment everyone involved. The man smiled and assured him that everything would be fine, only to mentally add that this gray-haired puppy should already be deader than a doornail. All of a sudden, the doors burst open with a crash, painted with valuable paints and elaborate robbery, and the councilman burst in, assuring the bride that everything would be all right. The clan head and future father-in-law shuddered all over and whirled around like a big bad wolf preparing to eat Little Red Riding Hood, when a lumberjack suddenly appeared on the scene. The official assured that he would make every effort to ensure that Yuan was released, and if dear Director Wang broke his promise, he would be persecuted to the grave. This visitor was too influential and powerful to be yelled at with impunity, so the antagonist agreed in a very gentle and polite voice. Ling, feeling like a weak roe deer surrounded by two hungry tigers, visibly sweated and very quietly asked this strange stranger to look after Yuan after her death. The councilman, like a cool, familiar uncle, assured her that everything would be fine. He would personally strangle these scum from the Kai family if they dared to lie. The director mumbled that yes, it was true, but he couldn't stop marveling at the fact that this politician from Parliament was behaving like some kind of rabid, indomitable animal. Realizing that she had found someone who wasn't ready to eat her alive, the girl mumbled that after her death, her dear brother would finally have to be released from Blackwater Prison. She didn't even know that she was talking to her masked brother right now, and he unfortunately didn't have the chance to reveal his cover right now. Wang, meanwhile, coughed delicately, calling over a very frivolously dressed maid and ordering her to relax the Jasper Lord in the VIP room. This was the same woman that the protagonist's monster saved in the first chapter, and she had a name, Anki, by the way. They walked in silence for a while up the stairs, which, like the rest of the house, cost so much that 1 million poor people would have to sell their kidneys to buy one. Suddenly, the student turned around, called the main character by name, and ordered him to run for his life because he had no chance to carry out his plan. This really took the protagonist by surprise. He basically did not expect that this doll has developed enough power to ignore his illusion. Yes, she also had level 3 and her own special powers, but that wasn't the point. It was that Lin Yuan would be flayed if he was noticed. Vaughn, a squad with a very high level, has arrived at the manor, plus Junior Wang himself with his 9th rank. Each of these arrogant teenagers can demolish whole mountains. And besides, the clan had assembled a whole regiment of 100 heads, and each fighter was also level 9 and was trained to sit in ambush, waiting for the cursed monster. The hero admitted that it sounded like a guaranteed meat grinder, but at the same time there was another question. How exactly this girl managed to get into such a story? Folding her arms across her chest, she chirped softly that this was repayment, and the atmosphere in the room subtly changed. The Jasper Lord, in his great mercy, had deigned to save her from being viciously abused by that bastard Kai. She simply couldn't ignore such a thing, and she had a very specific plan of action ready. She was going to observe the situation to signal the danger and give the precious master a chance to escape. Lin made a facepalm, trying to keep the emotions from bursting out, and only asked if she was really willing to risk her skin for that bonehead monster. And she shouted with genuine indignation that that merciful beast had saved her life and honor from real monsters, so don't you dare say that in front of her. And she was saying all this with such sincere, strong indignation, puffing out her cheeks in exasperation, that for the first time in history, Yuan simply felt awkward in front of someone. And then she just grabbed him by the sleeve and ordered him to leave this damned mansion immediately, while there was still a chance to save at least his own life. But suddenly there was a great commotion, and the maid slowly turned around, her face sweating with fear, and whispered that they seemed to have missed this train. The wedding ceremony had already begun, and the huge, fabulously expensive gates were slowly opening, illuminating the black silhouettes of the guests with a soft golden glow. Trying to pretend that everything is normal, the main character, while maintaining the appearance of councilman, asked if it was time for the dear bride to appear in public. But then one of Team 9 Abyss took the floor, creating shining shards of ice in his own palm. He warned everyone that there was a rat among the guests who had entered here without asking. Everyone present felt a huge shock and even horror, because it would have been easier to believe that the wolf literally entered the flock, pulling on a sheep's skin. The designated wolf, as yet unrecognized, frowned as he realized that the shepherds had finally realized something was wrong, and now they could unleash the dogs at any moment. But instead of attacking him with the whole pack, Han pointed an accusing finger at Anqi and shouted that it was this girl who dared to sneak in here in a fake image. The student realized that she was about to be killed, perhaps very slowly and painfully. But she was going to sacrifice herself to give the protagonist a chance to escape. Summoning all the strength she had, she concentrated it in her hands to unleash a torrent of crushing energy at the offenders and carry at least someone to the grave. However, she wasn't allowed to do any of this, simply because Lin Yuan had supernaturally grown between her and the opponent, as if he had always been there. He didn't waste time and energy shooting Kai, using secret ninja techniques or any other nonsense. He just stabbed the boy with a knife. With just one punch, he completely penetrated the armor, skin, muscles, and bones, killing this unfortunate thug. And Anne was trying to ask in a trembling voice why he did it. Lightning clenched his fist angrily, his entire body enveloped by the element after which he got his name. And he growled that the congressman had been the Trojan horse all along. Junior Wang was also not far away. He did not take his eyes off the vile werewolf and asked in an icy voice what all this was arranged for. The main character's answer was more than exhaustive, namely to kill every scumbag that was here, not to leave a single two-legged pig alive. The antagonist snorted with disdain that this was just a farce. A couple of low-level idiots appeared here and thought that they could defeat the powerful of this world. the elite of elites. Hearing the words that you won't run away, you will pay for everything, Lin only replied that this is just the beginning of the performance. And with a magician's gesture took out the cards from his pocket. Not 3, not 6, not even 90. But he produced hundreds of magic cards and threw them into the air, making it seem as if the hall was in the middle of a hurricane. Covered by the power dome, Lightning snorted even more disdainfully that his opponent was just a clown, using strong guises in such a ridiculous manner. Yin, meanwhile, openly laughed like a hyena, and shouted that dying from such an idiot's awkward punches would actually be fun. If he had known that his body would be chopped into small pieces in a few moments, he would definitely have held his long tongue as tightly as possible behind his teeth. To give Yuan his due, he immediately noticed that these deadly pieces of paper were attacking from the back and warned the remaining party members to be on their guard. Not that it helped, because that half-wit wizard was already lying on the floor in a disgusting pile of blood and meat, while the main character wasn't even sweating. Both Wang and Lightning were shocked to realize that these damn cards could fly at supersonic speeds, but the latter was much better at handling themselves than the former. As for the female student who had been in the middle of the battle all this time, she was the only one who thought of asking how Lin could use level 9 strikes. Well, Yuan couldn't summon monsters as usual in this situation for some reason, but there was nothing to stop him from using the cards themselves. And he had really rare and very strong cards as others saw on their own skins. Thanks to this small trick, he, an objectively average static person, only at the 6th level of power, could hit with power beyond his weight class. Meanwhile, Lightning began to levitate above the floor and beat electricity from all the cracks, for he, like a living god of thunder, was going to punish the impudent wicked. The air was heavy with the smell of thunderstorms, and Qi ruefully stroked her temple, mumbling that she was completely out of energy, and there was nothing she could do to help her escape. She was not destined to finish this sentence because she was hit by a real electric lightning bolt and was lifted into the air like 100 other people in the ceremony hall. This handsome man's control over his element wasn't limited to primitive electric shocks. He was also the master of electromagnetism in all its forms. But the main character was absolutely not impressed. He only noted in the most bored voice that he had seen the same legendary lightning technique. The villain was literally blinded by his power, so he did not notice the sarcasm, and only called Lin a poor, small, insignificant ant. And now, this pitiful insect had to be punished for its crimes in the face of those who ruled the rest of the people like living deities. The leader of the Abyss Squad gathered all the power of lightning and mystical energies at one point, turned himself into a living, crushing meteor from a raging current. It would seem that nothing, except perhaps a mountain of copper, can stop this revived and very evil force of nature. But it turned out that this is more than possible. A colossal, muscular figure loomed up in front of Lightning, and at first he was taken aback. But then he just shouted that you can't scare him with insignificant mirages anymore. The antagonist did not even doubt that his Thunderfist would easily dispel this illusion, and then turn its owner into a bloody mess. But for some reason this never happened. Bone-faced Beast stood completely unharmed and grinned derisively, while Abilitu user desperately tried to understand why his enemy had suddenly reached the awakened level. Yuan called him an idiot with disdain, because he had just killed a person whose strength was in creating power barriers, and now he could do the same. The giant monster grabbed the little man with its hands and tried to squeeze them, while Lightning desperately unlocked all its limbs and yelled to be released. The protagonist grinned nastily, literally savoring what was about to happen, and finally ordered his slave to swat this annoying insect. This Chinese venom gladly obeyed the order. With just one movement, he increased the pressure of his hand so much that the arrogant, handsome man turned into a pool of blood. It was a completely insane amount of it, and it would have been hard to imagine that a single human, and even such a skinny body, could have contained so much red liquid. It rained down in a veritable rainstorm, and Wang Yan looked on in such shock that he didn't even react when a lot of drops hit his face. Only then did he finally realize that this huge, black-skinned, white-faced, red-eyed bastard was the freak who had killed his little brother Kai. The main character didn't even turn around at his hysterical screams because he was busy with much more important things, carrying a lifeless Anqi in his arms. Only a few seconds later, he turned around and replied in a scary voice that he had come to hold the ghost wedding because it was time to reunite the Wang clan. It was at this moment that the headmaster, who is also the head of the clan, decided to show up on stage and say that he was furious about what happened, like calling the ocean a puddle. The man looked like a monster himself, with his grim visage and blazing eyes. But that was understandable, since the killer of his child had finally arrived. The protagonist, as in previous times, was completely unimpressed by this small performance. He only mockingly asked if Wang really wants revenge for his son so much. The question infuriated the villain so much that his head almost burst. There was so much blood stuck in it, and he growled that he wouldn't sleep until he hung the bastard. And this could even be understood. But the main character reasonably asked if the patriarch did not care how many lives his precious offspring broke or interrupted. But the headmaster really didn't give a damn. In his stronghold, he and his family were gods, and all these beggars and commoners were just nameless, easily replaceable toys. And he was already tired of talking, so he pointed a threatening finger at the main character and ordered his remaining son to immediately destroy this threat to them. Yuan yelled back that he would never allow this parasite to escape. His special extermination squad would block all exits, cut off all opportunities for escape. The entire Elite 100 that I mentioned earlier had heard their leader's order, and now they were rushing towards the church with all their might to tear the impudent man to pieces. But Lin Yuan, as unshakably confident as ever, simply said that he would not let anyone go alive either, and let the ghost wedding take on its true proportions. To do this, he immediately released from his cards 2 ghostly monsters created in the image of demons from the underworld, and playing musical instruments. It happened so suddenly that Yuan was taken aback, lost his fighting spirit, and could only ask hoarsely what kind of creatures they were. And they were already in action, raising their eerie, surreal trumpets to their lips and blowing into them, creating a sound so extraterrestrial that it couldn't be described. Its impact was not limited to the church premises, but this supernatural music was heard hundreds of meters in the area, and the cosmos itself seemed to cry from it. But even more terrifying was what it did to people, literally ripping out their screaming, terrified souls, making their bodies fall like lifeless dolls. Even those who didn't die instantly weren't much more fortunate, because the demonic sounds almost blew their heads off, causing blood to run out of all the holes. But one girl guessed what type of opponents they were facing and ordered her comrades to immediately get within 10 meters of her, hide under the barrier. Wang Yan was the second to come to his senses, and he essentially repeated her order, telling the rank-and-file soldiers to stick with those who were already close to waking up and gradually advance. That woman's name was also Lin, and she was one of the squad captains, but her power dome was very small, reaching no more than 10 meters in radius. The other captain, the shaven-headed burly Jew, snapped out with disdain that he wouldn't cover the skins of pathetic weaklings, even though his defensive barrier was twice as extensive. The one-eyed captain, nicknamed Twilight, could create a defensive zone with a radius of 30 meters. And unlike the previous one, he ordered his subordinates to hide with him. Finally, Captain Mo had the most extensive force field, and he could cover an area within a radius of, no, not even 40 or 50, but as much as 500 meters. In one fell swoop, he protected the rest of the army from sound attacks, and also noted that such screaming monsters have very low physical defense indicators. In other words, you just had to run to them and trample them into the mud, and Ju and Twilight were very enthusiastic about this idea. After that, the remaining squad members rushed forward, until one of them suddenly asked suspiciously why it was suddenly snowing from the sky in the warm season. On closer inspection, one would realize that these are not actually snowflakes, but some other things that look like scraps of paper with a cutout in the shape of a star. One mustachioed man scorned to burn the paper and explained that it was just ritual money for the dead. After all, it was in the cemetery. And then he screamed like a slaughtered pig, turned black, and began coughing up blood with terrible sounds, because the paper, surprisingly, turned out to be poisonous. After a few more seconds, his body simply burst, filling everything with pieces of meat and blood, as if this unfortunate person had been skinned by some invisible sadist. But he was not the only one, but simply the first. And in a few seconds more, the whole party was writhing in terrible convulsions, wheezing desperately, and then it was dead. Lin, who has red hair, immediately realized that the paper was marked with poison generated by the monster known as Yin Corp's mother vine. Unlike those ghostly musicians, spiders, or even bone-faced beasts, this creature didn't even remotely resemble a humanoid, but rather a huge microbe. The main character was not going to leave anyone alive. He repeated over and over again that there should be no survivors at the ghost wedding, except for him and his sister. Mother Vine was essentially a demonic variation of a parasitic mushroom that used all available undead to grow in size and strength, all the way up to C rank. And after all, this cemetery also buried users of superpowers, so if you don't kill that stuff right now, it will grow to insane proportions. But, Mo added smugly, this small-minded assassin was unlucky enough to challenge him, and together with the rest of the captains, they would finish off the monster's master soon. Lin, Ju, and Twilight, all of them rushed forward like the points of a trident, ready to support each other and overwhelm the intruder with numbers, skill, and pressure. And the main character, which was probably the most offensive thing, didn't even try to leave, put up a defense or anything, he just didn't give a damn. But the captains didn't care about his relationship either. They had a clear command to finish off the bastard disguised as a councilman and start a massacre. Alas, this heroic assault on the enemy never took place, because firstly, they were separated by a huge distance, and secondly, the demonic storm intensified. However, the bespectacled man, still without changing his expression, simply ordered the others to stay behind him and follow all his orders. Then everything would be fine with them. The interior of the banquet hall was decayed and desolate, destroying any hint of solemnity, and Yuan wondered if his teammates would be able to win now. Grinning like a gorged viper, his father announced that any cause for concern was gone, because Wang Mo was a real genius, their living masterpiece. For the sake of victory, this four-eyed psychopath was ready to go to the most vile measures, including killing his allies in order to suck all their strength and life out of them. Now he has achieved a temporary awakening of his soul and gained tremendous power. That's what it means to calculate everything in advance and never lose. Even Yuan was horrified at the sight of this, while his father, on the contrary, looked so smug, like a master bragging about how his dog tears everyone's throats. And he really started doing it, vividly describing how this little madman killed his own older brother and burned down his old house because he didn't like his life. Now that he was fully enhanced, he cast a special spell on Lin Yuan, which completely cut off the possibility of teleportation or any other escape method. He also knew perfectly well that the enemy's monster would only evolve in a few minutes, which meant that he was completely defenseless and had to say the last words. What he didn't expect was that instead of begging for mercy, he would receive a beam of pink energy that would break through his blue barrier, and through him. Then Mo did exactly what one would expect from a cliched villain, rolling his eyes in disbelief, desperately wheezing that this couldn't be happening, and so on. It was just that the monster had already turned into a hybrid of Beholder and Cthulhu, and Wang didn't understand how it could be at all if he had calculated the time accurately. The protagonist indifferently called him an idiot, and then clearly demonstrated an IMB card that accelerated the evolution of creatures by 10%. And when the next villain collapsed lifeless, Director Wang screamed in hysterical grief, even to the news of the death of his blood offspring. He did not react so violently, and then he was furious, because the bastard not only killed his own son, but also sent his adopted son to the next world, where such a thing is seen. Even Yuan himself noticed this, and directly highlighted whether the clan leader did not value some foster child much more than any of his own descendants. But that wasn't so important, because this vaunted genius that Wang had put so much trust in, invested so much money and resources into developing, is now just dead. And it wasn't Lin who was going to exterminate their entire family that was to blame, of course, but the man who foolishly used the strongest trump card in the beginning and lost it. Now that he was cornered without any advantages, the villain could only grit his teeth and ask who he was talking to, why the enemy was so eager for their deaths. It was at this moment, by an incredibly far-fetched coincidence, that the illusion cast by Shadow ended its action, showing everyone the real face of the protagonist. The antagonist was so surprised, furious, and shocked that all the blood vessels in his eyes burst, turning them purple. He was sure that this little bastard was already dead. With a hideous grin on his lips alone, Yuan replied in a gentle voice that he had sent that message from prison himself, and he also had a special gift in store. After that, the tentacles of the monster lifted into the air the severed head of the Wang clan's palace manager, whom bone-faced beast once smeared on the wall. The death of this mustache man further crushed the spirit of the once proud director, because this man was not only his henchman but also his older brother. His son, on the other hand, had gone completely mad with anger and now attacked the hated killer, regardless of all possible consequences and risks. The blonde man put all his strength into smashing the blonde bastard's skull with a single blow, but instead, his fist only ignominiously collided with an impenetrable barrier. Corpse Monster took control of the body and abilities of the dead Mo, because the main character decided that it would be incredibly ironic if he killed his foster family. And he really was a great master at everything that involved manipulating space, something Lin Yuan could give Wang credit for. The director, feeling chilling fear, shouted that the main character should wait a little because his sister was still there. But he did not have time to finish the sentence. The protagonist finally got sick of wasting his time on these disgusting parasites, and in a cold, contemptuous voice, he ordered them to be killed at last. The meat puppet that was once one of them was now unable to object or refuse, and dutifully raised its hand, which had accumulated deadly energy. It wasn't a trivial annihilation with an explosion, a stream of flames, or anything else, no. The possessed corpse could literally slice the two of them into space. For a moment, this entire colossal hall was drowned in a flood of blue, and the bodies of the remaining Wang clan members began to rapidly disappear, turning into crumbs. No pleas for mercy, no attempts to buy their own lives or even curse the enemy before they died. They simply ceased to exist, as if they had never existed. These poor idiots never managed to figure out that the clever Yuan had replaced his real sister with an illusory copy, and he hadn't abandoned the unconscious Anne either. But now that both families were safely reunited and a dear relative was in his arms, the main character was about to head home. After some time, the whole city was set on its ears by crazy screams that the end of the world was coming, and only by accepting monsters as gods can people survive. A whole army of religious fanatics, dressed in the most stereotypical black robes with deep hoods and holding candles on their palms, walked down the street and scared everyone. Their leaders, not sparing their lungs and vocal cords, shouted that there was no other way to salvation, and the events that occurred in the cemetery near the church are an example of this. Almost everyone looked at them as if they were insane and avoided them. Only one girl was melancholically licking a lollipop, and even the protagonist was silently watching from a distance. They're also managed to get in the same student who now put on the robe in which they star in adult films, and she sincerely campaigned to worship the bone-faced beast. Even the main character, who was not used to watching other people's nonsense, was as awkward and strange as possible to watch this surrealism. As she played with them, she whispered seductively that he should have accepted their faith, since he too had been saved in the cemetery massacre. And no, there can be no doubt about her own faith. She was going to devote herself physically and spiritually to that huge, black, muscular master. The main character was thinking with his upper head, not his lower one, so he just turned around and started walking away, finally telling someone else to try to brainwash them. A flushed student shouted orders not to leave because she would carry the word of her new god from one end of the world to the other. But no one gave a damn. Despite the fact that the fortress was a bulwark of humanity against supernatural creatures, it functioned exactly like any peaceful metropolis. The main character stood on the roof of a high-rise building, watching ordinary people as if they were ants, and idly pondering that the world was moving in a strange direction. He didn't even turn around when a young official wearing large glasses appeared behind him, knelt down on one knee, and called him master in an extremely servile tone. Wang Mo, the resurrected Mother Vine, also served as the deputy minister of criminal law, and he was very careful so that no one noticed that he was communicating with a dead person. The bespectacled man had destroyed all traces that might indicate his master's involvement in the tragedy, and he had also checked on the heir to the Wang clan fortune, a certain Huang Long. This eagle-eyed, bearded man was one of the Awakened, the strongest fire element tamer with a huge number of disciples, among them the now-deceased Yuan. The main character, with a faint smirk on the edges of his lips, drawled that yes, it was clear why this guy was looking for a meeting with him, after he himself had squandered all the wealth of his relatives. Whatever the case, the young man was going to meet this person, clearly sensing that he would be able to reap a lot of benefits from this small incident. The undead asked in an extremely respectful tone that the master should remain extremely careful, because in the event of a conflict, Long promises to be the most dangerous enemy. Smiling a little more broadly, the main character assured him that he had a plan of action for such a case. But let Mo think about keeping his job and not giving himself away. Obeying the unspoken wish of his puppeteer, the dead man replied that his fate was sealed, and now he would serve the master faithfully, like a loyal dog. When Lin Yuan finished feeding his sense of self-importance at the expense of the new puppet, he graciously let him go back to work, and the dead man teleported away. In a way, there was a deliciously dark irony to this turn of events. Mo was going to be the king of the fortress, and he was just a map. The dojo that Long and his men were in looked exactly as one would expect from a Fire Lord, with a strict geometric design and a flame emblem on top. The new antagonist sat in a large, throne-like chair, his face shadowed like the Fire Lord Ozai, as the main character slowly approached him. He had no fear of this man or his pack of disciples, so he simply and directly admitted that yes, he was the Lin. After giving him a searing glare, Huang just as openly admitted that he planned to destroy him, just as he had finished destroying what was left of the Wang family. The boy's face went rigid and incredibly angry as a simple white cloth garment was thrown at his feet, like a bone and pieces of meat for a pesky dog. Long quietly said that his sister should have died at that wedding, gone after that bastard Kai, but now they will all pay, even if they are not officially charged. Yuan, regaining his composure and no longer openly showing signs of anger, even under the sneering grins of the local students, quietly noted that the clothes were mourning. So it was, because Huang, in his great mercy, was willing to give him, his sister, and father 3 days to burn themselves alive for ritual purposes. Then the grievances would be lifted. Raising his head to look directly at his face, the monster tamer asked very calmly what would happen if he refused it. The bearded man grinned and growled that no one in this fortress would dare to refuse an awakened one. Otherwise, they would face a much crueler retribution than the suicide described above. Smiling in his trademark way, just with his lips, the main character quietly added that he, in fact, is also from among the powerful of this world, and showed his bracelet. He had just registered as a level 17 awakened, and if anyone touched him, the madman would be punished. And all the hyena grins were immediately wiped off the students' faces. Unlike his students, Long didn't even bat an eye and even admitted that it was indeed an incredibly clever trick. But still, Lin didn't live in his territory. At that time, the protagonist was already tired of playing Mr. Polite. He openly called Huang a thick-headed stooge and said that he did not just show up here alone. The antagonist's response was extremely effective, as he instantly threw his body into the air and enveloped a good quarter of the hall in raging flames. He also thundered in a demonic voice that in front of him, a true awakened, all these wretched, mundane intrigues and conspiracies are not even worth a damn egg. But Lin Yuan's face only twisted in disdain, and he repeated that this cheap copy of Ozai and Sozin couldn't kill him, no matter how much she wanted to. The villain instantly quieted down and began to slowly sink to the ground, while the firestorm behind him just as slowly subsided. The students of the fire dojo looked on in horror. They couldn't understand what was going on at all, and why their master hadn't already turned the insolent boy into a firebrand. It wasn't until a heavy snowfall and a drop in temperature in this hall, contrary to all possible expectations, that they realized that someone had secretly abused the elements. A few moments later, all these poor fools were simply devoured by a huge wall of ice, like frozen herring in an ancient freezer. It was very appropriate to confront the Flame Lord using ice and snow, and Huang immediately realized that, contrary to his own words, the protagonist had brought an ally. It turned out to be another woman with the figure of an adult movie actress, wearing such an outfit that everyone could easily see her. This girl's name was Ning Xuan. She wore a large blindfold like a blind person, respectfully called the protagonist young brother, and asked if she could kill this old man. Long again admitted that it was a smart move, but he heated up his fire even more, reminding them that he was still the strongest lord of the flame, and he would burn their very souls if necessary. Restraining himself from stretching his mouth into a huge horse grin, the main character graciously promised the man a duel, but only sometime in the future. If Huang doesn't listen and attacks now, first of all, he will use up all his strength to confront his ice sister, and second, he will become an outcast for the entire fortress. Therefore, Yuan was going to postpone the duel until he passed the official awakening exam, but the antagonist quietly asked why he thought he would pass it. Turning his back to him, Lin already indifferently threw out that this has nothing to do with the Lord of Fire. Let him just think again and make the right decision not to rush into a fight. He and Ning were about to leave when the protagonist remembered the dojo students and assured their mentor that they would only be frozen for another 30 seconds. However, the woman did not miss the opportunity to promise that she would kill not only this ancient, evil, bearded man, but also all those idiots who learned from him if Long broke the promise. Huang had no choice but to let the young men go in peace, and already outside, Yuan warned that she had only returned at the request of her sworn brother. She helped him, but then he would have to deal with everything himself. And it was time for her to go home. But Yuan still asked why his dear sister was leaving him so quickly. The reason was good. The forces of the Abyss are becoming more dangerous every month. The 26th fortress has already fallen, and Lin better advance his cultivation as soon as possible. Hearing the sworn assurance that everything would be as it should be, the young Snow Queen quickened her pace and was about to set off when she was hailed again. Perhaps she was blind, or just hiding her eyes for some reason, but in any case, she realized that she was being joked at, almost poking a small piece of paper in her face. This ice maiden also turned out to be tsundere, because she blushed deeply and sternly demanded that she no longer do this. Otherwise, she might even kill with a sword in fright. And after that, she teleported away very quickly, not forgetting, however, to ask her sworn brother to take care of his life. Lin Yuan thought that Ning might have kept her mouth shut, but he knew that she had to get permission to leave her area of the Abyss and come to his aid. But that's okay. He's bound to be the strongest brother in the world to protect all his sisters from anything. That's what he thought when the car pulled up to him. The prison matron who had been forced by the boy to become his servant under threat of murder stepped out, and she quietly informed him that she had obeyed the order. The main character was very pleased, and he admitted, in the voice of a happy owner of a smart dog, that he was not mistaken in his choice, since she coped with that task in a few days. Raising her hand to her, the woman said that she lives for her master. Well, and she also forced a certain person to sign a certain contract. She also threw his wife and children into prison. And Yuan was even more pleased because his new servant was not only smart, but also a completely merciless trash. Unfortunately, the new owner of Blackwater Prison did not have the right to leave her post for a long time, and the teenager graciously allowed her to return. He already learned everything from her that was required. After that, the action shifted to an underground auction, which was held by the prison administration in deep secrecy from the public in order to fill their wallets. Tickets here were sold on the dark web, and at a high cost, at least one guy had to pay as much as $300,000 to get through. However, everyone was much more interested in the question of where an ordinary, even large government prison could get so many valuable artifacts for sale. There was also a reasonable suggestion that the guards simply gutted dead prisoners, literally disassembling them for spare parts in search of various valuables. Rolling his eyes dreamily, a well-groomed hunk whispered that the new head matron was a true business genius, but that her husband would have a hard time with her for years to come. The other person nodded in agreement, saying that yes, she might look like a pathetic and weak doll, but this woman's abilities were actually something to be envied. Meanwhile, in the VIP room, Bai Lin sat humbly on her lap like a real slave and presented her precious master with a catalog of available goods. Idly looking at the documents and swinging his legs, Yuan noted with some condescension that the work was not bad, especially this compromising material on criminal groups. Hearing that the auction will also have the slots he needs, the protagonist was much more cheerful and admitted that most of all he wants to get a certain special treasure. She wasn't some kind of fairy and couldn't grant wishes just by waving a magic wand, so she couldn't guarantee a purchase, unlike destroying criminals. With a smug grin, the main character refused because it would create too much noise. And secondly, he liked fair competition. After some time, Bai came on stage with a microphone to give a welcoming speech full of pathos to the participants that there are no laws and regulations here. Here and now, these fat walking purses reveal the most apocalyptic treasures of the human world. Absolute power and any desires. A very fat but intelligent man noticed that Lin was late because she had been sitting on her lap for a long time. And this caused a heated argument among the audience until they were asked to shut up. When the stands were quiet again, an object that looked like a wheelchair was rolled onto the stage, covered with a long red blanket. It was only necessary to remove it, and everyone saw that under it was not an artifact, but a living person, a gray-haired, bearded, and mustachioed old man, tied to a chair with belts and gagged. There was a huge uproar in the audience because, seriously, who here would be interested in some ancient, bony grandfather? What a stupid joke. The glamorous host, not a bit embarrassed, took the microphone and announced to the whole hall that this man is actually a monstrous criminal sentenced to death. He was a serial killer and cannibal with 18 lives to his credit, but he was also a divine surgeon who performed every operation he undertook perfectly. Now people understood what the deal was all about. and two of the customers shouted almost simultaneously that they were willing to buy it out for spinal surgery or a heart transplant. Slyly flashing his glasses in his own teeth, the host announced that the audience was a little overreacted, and the real price for this Dr. Mark is 50 million. The whole hall was filled with gasps, and short screams. Everyone who heard about this colossal price came to such a strong shock. No, everyone in the stands were millionaires and used to count money in tens and hundreds of thousands. But 50 million was too cool even for them. The first to regain his composure was the head of one of the first 10 families of the fortress, Hode, whose son had suffered a very serious brain injury and needed better treatment. He was ready to pay the amount indicated, but then Shubing, the director of Shining Era Medical Group, joined in the bidding, who was ready to lay out 55 million. This brought the audience to life again, and one by one the moneybags rose from their seats, shouting out bets and waving signs with the amounts drawn in the air. Hua's face took on an icy expression. He was going to save his beloved offspring at all costs, and so he raised the bid to 80 million without hesitation. Bing snorted that he only wanted to save his child, but she wanted to save all the people. So she also raised the amount to 85 with the same zeal. A well-groomed, refined aristocrat, who looked like a portrait painted by a very flattering artist come to life, thundered his cane on the floor in exasperation. Rising from his seat, he shouted to the entire audience that he was doubling the amount, the prison would get 170 million, and he would be able to save his son. No one else was able or dared to outbid such a large bet, fearing the wrath of the audience, and the host happily announced that the ogre doctor had been sold. Optimism dripped from his voice like honey from a broken beehive as he congratulated a client. But he added later that Mark was a maniac and needed to be watched. The next slot was a blue heart that had once belonged to Superhuman, and whoever transplanted this thing into their chest would have all the powers of its former owner. Later on, a person was put up for sale again, a very fat woman with hypnotic abilities who could live 3 lifetimes and solve many of the owner's problems. The last thing mentioned was not an artifact or a living creature, but an entire building, a huge high-class hotel where you could wait out the apocalypse in paradise conditions. The hall was drowned out in shouts. Rich people, one after another, jumped up from their seats, waving signs and just hands, demanding one of the goods or even all of them for a huge amount of money. Watching this as if it were a farce, the protagonist noted that Bai had come up with a great way to make money. With 300 million, they could easily buy the offal of that dragon. The prison mistress blushed very deeply, and her heart began to beat with such force as if it was going to tear her chest to pieces, because the master himself finally thanked her. For her, a mentally broken person with a canine mindset, that in itself was the greatest reward. But then a spider demon appeared in the room. She looked as if it was only by heroic willpower that she was restraining herself from tearing this vile human female with 2 pathetic hands into tiny pieces. Trying to sound as gentle and calm as possible, she reminded the monster that they all belonged to the same Jasper Lord, so there was no reason to quarrel. Yuan made a face as if he had seen such scenes 1,000 times before and was tired of them 1,000 times, and only ordered the two to finish their foolishness and get back to business. As he expected, the buyer of the first lot will be Hode, the owner of the dojo where Huang Long lives, so the latter will have to put up with a reduced meal ticket. And by buying Mark, this rich halfwit has set his family on a path to certain destruction, because when they find out about it, everyone from young to old will turn against him. Oh, it was incredibly sad and tragic. And now, the main character decided, was the perfect time to use his silver spider. The next slot was a statue called Blood Arhat, which had the mystical property of charging all living beings with cultivation energy for 300 meters. Any dojo or noble clan was willing to go to any expense, any crime, to lay hands on such a treasure and create a super soldier. There was one problem. Its ability extended to monsters, so you had to use Arhat carefully so as not to wake up with a flea on the skin of Cthulhu. Then Zhao Yuan, the Lord of Thunder and Lightning, finally entered the bargain, who was going to turn this statue into a wedding gift for the beautiful Ning Xuan. Their families had made a prenuptial agreement long ago because of the Zhao clan's vast wealth, but the Ice Lady had tried her best to avoid this unpleasant fate. The sworn sister might have been a fool to fight the Fire Lord over that pig, Lin Yuan, but the noble prince was going to hush up the conflict by killing the hero. He didn't even realize that the main character was watching him very closely from the top floor. And what's more, he was expecting this handsome guy, and now they're in the same game. After that, a short flashback began, the action of which took place 6 months ago at the training base located near West Abyss. It was a dojo for Thunderbolt ability users, and there was a disciplinary lesson going on, and hundreds of youths were sitting with the stillness of statues on one knee. Among them was the main character, and his neighbors were cursing under their breath, discussing a certain 9th big brother, who was still not on the parade ground. Everyone was sure that he was just a spoiled, vicious freak who loved to bully weaker people. But then someone flinched in horror when they saw something ahead. It was the man in question, wearing a gorgeous flowing cloak of rich purple and a collar of white fur. Sure enough, it was the same Zhao. And as he glittered in the sun with his perfect six-pack abs, he nonchalantly replied that he was sorry for being a little late. It was all the fault of the mysterious madman, but everyone knew perfectly well that it was just a stinking lie. and anyone who seriously offended this ghoul would immediately be killed by it. Then came a cliched, self-congratulatory speech about how people like him, ability users from ancient noble families, were like gods among poor people. The protagonist's face went rigid as he heard his namesake say that they were all just nameless cannon fodder for the abyssal spawn. They should remember it better than their names and birthdays. And, Zhao added finally, no one should even dare to look at Ning, because this beauty will be his. All these insignificant worms that stink of poverty and disenfranchisement should even refuse to fantasize about it, because it will be the worst mistake they will make. Then, there was a tremendous explosion of force, and the ground shook with the shockwave, and it also lifted several people into the air with the same ease with which the wind carries leaves. This smug, rich bastard with a silicone press killed dozens of people in one go, leaving only their limbs and clothes torn off. This was the punishment that awaited anyone who ever decided that he was worthy to even kiss Yuan's foot. And no one could stop him, because he was rich, noble, and powerful. After this unpleasant flashback, the action returned to the present moment when the richest people of the fortress continued to bargain for the prison's trophies. Yuan, who is evil and rich, was absolutely sure that nothing else would dare to stop him from shopping. After all, he is from the Living God clan. But Shu Bing also wanted to get an arhat to help the sick person. But besides Zhao, she also had a rival in the person of Linux Jin, the owner of a rich private museum. They were willing to part with a sum of up to 70 million, but the antagonist, maintaining a lazy and simpering tone, put up a whole 100 million for auction. Some of the patrons almost dropped their jaws as they realized how rich this Thunder clan was to squabble with money so easily. The medical company really needed this artifact, and to add it to its arsenal, the woman was ready to go to any lengths, even to part with more than 100 million. Linux Jin didn't want to be left behind either, so he raised the bid by 10 million, becoming the absolute favorite in the Arhat hunt for a while. Zhao, grinning impudently, reminded that the museum is actually a disguised base for a group of assassins, and Bing does not have an amount exceeding 190 million. He could easily have offered $200 million for the stone, and as for the museum, he wouldn't have ordered even the smallest stone to be left of the damned building. Well, he had told everyone that he always got what he wanted, and it should have been treated with the same humility as when objects were thrown down. Some of the visitors, mostly women, actually agreed with this and even approved of this sleek male, while others clutched their heads in horror at such a monster. But then the situation took a completely unexpected turn, because Bai, intercepting the microphone from the host, added that a mysterious client from the VIP area offered even more. Everyone turned to look at the wall with the windows and the big gold letters VIP, and below them were television screens showing the figure of 201 million. Looking at this with the same annoyance as a cow cake suddenly appearing on a clear road, Yuan villain raised his bid to 220. But in response, the mysterious buyer also raised the bid, but by exactly 1 million, as if he wanted to laugh at this smug peacock. This young thunderer doesn't have much composure at all. The atmosphere around him was as tense as before a thunderstorm, and he quietly asked Lin if she wanted to do something. The woman, in turn, calmly retorted that the mysterious client does not do anything that would contradict the rules of the auction, so there are no complaints against him. Zhao was so angry that the blood vessels in his eyes burst, turning them red as he growled that he was willing to pay 250 million. But every time he called out his sum, the faceless opponent raised it by exactly 1 million, and this anecdotal confrontation continued to 300. Yuan was as furious as an elephant in the Musta period, and he gnashed his teeth and reminded the mysterious troll how rich and powerful his family was, so let him show some respect. In response, a text filled with contempt appeared on the screens, its author asking how this boy even considers himself, since he demands from him, "God forgive me, respect." Then a Chinese character appeared on the screen, which translated into English meant an order to go to hell in the most crude and vulgar form possible. This was the final straw. The antagonist's entire body was engulfed by lightning, and he growled that he hoped the mysterious madman understood the consequences he would face. But he didn't have time to throw a ball of destructive energy at the wall, because he was quickly surrounded by a squad of soldiers, all of them ready to open fire with compact grenade launchers. Glaring at the young nobleman with her glowing coal-like eyes, Lin reminded him that even an awakened must abide by the prison's rules, otherwise there would be no auction. Facing restriction and prohibition for the first time in his life, feeling like a loser for the first time, Zhao almost ground his teeth to powder and growled, "That's 500 million. Inside the VIP room, the main character, complacently leaning on the sofa and putting his chin on his hands, hissed that now his beloved older brother had fallen into a trap. Ordinary visitors couldn't believe the size of the amount mentioned earlier, because even for such an ancient and influential clan, this is a huge amount of money. The director of the museum, sweating profusely from excitement, panted to himself that no one else here had such a huge amount as this spoiled brat. The villain's face was as grim as a thundercloud as he looked loudly around the room, asking if any other dog wanted to try to compete with him. Looking at him through the screens with the face of a little sadist about to rip off a fly's wings, the main character quietly said that he wanted to buy the artifact for 800 million. The news made the audience naturally go into hysterics, because, damn it, this is almost a full billion. And this mysterious billionaire is even dumber than Zhao. Yuan simply couldn't resist using petty, childish insults, calling his namesake a weakling and demanding that he immediately disappear from the scene. The young nobleman, whose pride had never been hurt by anything before, was so angry that the veins on his head almost tore the skin. They were so swollen. Here a certain blonde man in an expensive black suit playfully adjusted his glasses on his nose and insinuated that if the young master needed funds, he would be happy to help. Wei Xing, a despised pervert who hunts for photos of women's asses, has magically transformed himself into a powerful and rich pawnbroker. And the evil Yuan didn't appreciate this suggestion at all. On the contrary, he looked in a way that made it clear that only security had kept him from immediately killing the bespectacled man. But the protagonist's assistant calmly explained that he only wanted to help, and he would do so if Zhao would give him 2 of the mines belonging to his clan on bail. The promised amount promised to reach 1 billion, and then Bai skillfully added fuel to the fire, repeating the hero's bet and asking if anyone would risk outbid her. We also whispered ingratiatingly that it wouldn't cost much. Even the voice of a young aristocrat wouldn't be needed. Just 1 quick receipt was enough. Finally, another insult to the main character appeared on the screen, where he threatened to buy an artifact and take Ning as his wife. And Zhao, perhaps for the first time in his life, was afraid. He wasn't a human anymore. He was an enraged monster, capable only of scribbling pen on paper and growling that he was bound to kill this faceless bastard. Xing quickly whispered to the new customer that the mysterious troll couldn't bet more than 1 billion and 200 million, and they could beat him to it right now. For a moment, even this golden boy was taken aback, wondering if it was worth it. But then he took a mental breath and agreed to give this huge sum. No one could believe their ears. No one could realize that someone would agree to part with such wealth for any Arhat. This was the real apotheosis of idiocy. And then Lin Yuan, with a gentle smile, calmly announced that he was making a new bid that surpassed this one by as much as 400 million. The audience couldn't even groan or shout. They were just so shocked that they could only drop their jaws on their chests, and only the prison warden was grinning contentedly. Wei calmly flipped through a page in the file and admitted that he had received a new contract for an additional billion, but he could only buy it by pledging all of Zhao's mines. Losing all semblance of self-control, the young antagonist madly roared that that bastard couldn't even have 1.25 billion. Xing, adjusting his points, added that they missed the transfer of enemy funds and let the villain bet 2 billion at once, and if he does not win, the contracts will be terminated. Evil Yuan's entire body turned into one huge ball of swollen muscles and veins as he signed the proposed document out of a desperate desire to win. And after that, nothing happened. The screen on the wall of the VIP room didn't light up, as if her abode decided to wash its hands of it and quietly disappear from the auction. The other participants in the event jumped up from their seats and screamed like a flock of frightened monkeys, unable to believe what was happening right in front of their eyes. And driven to madness, Zhao screamed, laughed, and shouted that he always gets what he wants. Absolutely always. And no one can ever take the trophy away from him. Smiling gently, Bai solemnly announced to the entire hall that the Blood Arhat was won by a young master from the Lightning Conqueror clan. Xing, hiding the documents, ominously added that now the boy must carefully monitor the tax assets and pay everything with interest, otherwise it will be very bad for him. Giving him a murderous look, Zhao reminded him that he was a living god. He could do anything, and he would definitely marry Yuan, and then become the undisputed ruler of the entire fortress. In the VIP room, Bai announced to the main character that his plan worked perfectly. The villain got a damaged stone, and they took the remains of the dragon and the spider evolved. Evil Yuan has no chance of getting married, because the stone was damaged and cursed. It would drive the nearby cultivators crazy. But the happy youth didn't know that yet. Wei then respectfully added that the antagonist's signatures are on all the papers they need. So now his family's mines belong to the Union of Shadow Organizations. Oh, the earners will then be killed or driven mad by alien shadow creatures from the abyss. So the mafia will also put additional pressure on new debtors. Once again adding what a brilliant master they had and how well the plan he had devised had worked, the prison mistress obsequiously asked what they should do next. Turning around from the window, the teenager explained that they now needed to focus on the true enemy, the Huanglong fire dragon, and that lightning thrower was just a snack. After that, the action moved briefly to the future, when only 1 day remained before the most significant awakened test. The young man jumped up from his seat as if everything before had been just a very pleasant dream. And now he was back in the harsh reality where he was a nobody, a nameless beggar. This atmosphere was also reinforced by the appearance of an angry father with a chef's spatula, shouting that Yuan was just a lazy parasite, not like his hardworking and talented sister. Other than that, the Lin family's everyday life was very trivial, with my brother stifling yawns as he came out of the bathroom, and my sister getting dressed and warning me that my father had burned breakfast. Looking like a model on a catwalk and beaming with delight, she chirped goodbye that she had received a pharmacist's license, and now all she had to do was pick it up from the committee. The father of the family immediately began to cry that here, the mother of his children is common, but how different they are. The daughter is smart and pretty, and the son is just a lazy pig, a freeloader. With a tired sigh, the protagonist reminded him that his father himself was nothing more than an ordinary worker. And in general, he had had enough of being lectured, and he was leaving for breakfast. His father didn't let him leave, not to scold him, but to give him 200 yen in gratitude for saving Ling during that chaos. Yet he had picked up some talents. Hearing the accusation of weakness after that, the protagonist rolled his eyes tiredly, took the money, and said that he was leaving. The food store would close any minute. Long after that, his father shouted moral advice after him. Only now he called him not a parasite, but a kind, gentle child, opposed to the harsh world. Someone was unlucky enough to get a cruel or indifferent father at birth, but the main character was unlucky in another sense. His father resembled a mother hen. Inside the right store, he was met by a European salesman, very stereotypical, plump-cheeked and mustached, like a walking caricature of the Bavarians. He was beaming, and the main character smiled back as he ordered his usual breakfast of meatloaf, fried sticks, and soy milk. The good-natured fat man quickly packed everything up, advising him to also carefully monitor his treasure, because now do not feed people bread. Let them rob an honest person. His wife, who was almost as plump and good-natured, added with dreamy nostalgia that Yuan grew up before their eyes. He is the most well-mannered young man here. At first glance, it might seem that literally the entire district adores the main character and treats him as a favorite pupil. But in the past, the hero was mercilessly bullied. This gave him a reputation for being a failure in the present, but the teenager finally broke away from this company, reminding him that he had to make it to school for lessons. When he disappeared, the store owner complained heavily about this bitch life, which sends such nice and good-natured people to the bottom, making them the lowest link in the food chain. And then the streets were drowned in smoke and a terrible roar, because 3 cars raced through them, striking sparks from the asphalt, and they were very damaged. Naturally, they belonged to local mobsters, and one of them, with a sneer, informed the neighbors that their boss was out of jail and now wanted to talk. This led everyone to despair and horror, because this greedy, disgusting, and cruel man understood only 2 languages, violence and money. But his worst crime was probably not that he was running a racket on innocent and helpless people, but that he had the audacity to be like Sir Crocodile. The cook came out first, and he folded his arms and begged this cheap imitation of the great pirate, saying that times were hard and the profits were not flowing in rivers. And if they start demanding more money from him, then he will simply not be able to pay the bills for the store, and will be forced to close it, and please do not bring it to this. An insignificant freak, who at least had a scar on his forehead and not on his nose, panted that he too should survive, and let the shop close even now. But the money will be given for a year in advance. If he doesn't get the money right now, then his bone cruisers will just burn down the store and kill everyone who is here to make a clear example for others. And none of his goons objected to this outcome, by the way. On the contrary, they were literally looking forward to breaking a few skulls and leaving with torches. Ordinary residents froze in horror, and only the shop owner continued to desperately beg the head of the mafia to listen to them, to show mercy. But even this was in vain. It was at this moment, to everyone's surprise, that the main character, who had managed to forget something, reappeared on the stage and was now running, almost losing his shoes. Barely stopping after such a long and intense run, the smiling youth panted that the thing he had forgotten about was the purchase price. The Chinese gangster was so taken aback by what he saw and heard that he bit his thick, steaming cigar in 2, and his teeth gritted from the terrible pressure. The adults now started yelling at the main character to run for his own life, while wailing that he was a very good boy and didn't cause any problems. Bone Crusher, with a huge vertical scar across his left eye, scowled, sucked air through his broad chest, and croaked that Yuan now had to pay too. What he didn't expect was that his own leader would hit him so hard on the head that he would fall to the ground and call him a suicidal lunatic. And then all the criminals, except for the unconscious thug, collapsed in front of the main character, as if he were their living and very, immensely hot-tempered god. But so far, the protagonist had to play a comedy in front of the neighbors and, making as surprised a face as possible, asked what the hell was going on. The crocodile impersonator, meanwhile, became even more humiliated, lamenting that he deserved the cruelest death for insulting the boss's friends, even if out of ignorance. The neighbors themselves watching this experienced quite understandable shock, because since when do snotty schoolchildren become monstrous kings of the criminal world? And this was one of the very few things that could frighten this unstoppable cultivator, because he was insanely afraid to see the fear and shame in the eyes of his clansmen. Meanwhile, the criminal continued to lie on the ground, whimpering miserably and lamenting that he, a miserable pig, a miserable worm, and a miserable jackal, was not worthy of life. Only because of the deepest shock, the peaceful inhabitants of this area did not shout good obscenities. They were not even able to take their reddened eyes away from this surrealism. The main character, struggling to pretend to be an ordinary, uninteresting boy, mumbled that he was confused with someone, probably with his classmate from the triads. This non-crocodile whimpered at first that this couldn't have happened, that he was his loyal subordinate, and that he wouldn't have allowed this to happen. And then, to the great surprise of his own thugs, he jumped to his feet, grinned broadly, and confessed that it really was a mistake. Sorry about that. Yuan replied with a very sweet and kind smile and chirped back that since the misunderstanding was successfully resolved, Then he would go to school and these uncles would go about their business. The remaining adults slowly gathered in a circle and began to discuss it was in general. They were asleep and had a strange dream or what? One man was ready to believe that in the class of the protagonist, there is a very similar all-powerful prince of the mafia, triads, and yakuza, but the other woman is not. They were arguing furiously and discussing how strange it was for a nice homely guy like Yuan. And they didn't know that he was actually listening to them while hiding around the corner. He was shaking his head and clucking his tongue in frustration, just like a teacher preparing to punish students who had failed. And the sweaty bandits looked exactly like that. After making sure that no other dog was able to eavesdrop on him, Lin revealed his true, sinister side and asked who allowed him to be called master. Members of the triad once again fell to their knees and began to tearfully beg for mercy. Yes, they were guilty and deserve the most terrible punishment, but forgive them. Boring this gang with a murderous look, the teenager reminded that he released them from prison so that they could do good deeds. And they decided to arrange something. They must remember for the rest of their lives that their only mission now is to secretly protect his family and neighbors from other scum. Or else, all these thugs, murderers, and scum fell to their knees again, almost kissing the ground, and began to whimper that this was exactly what they would do, even if they had to sacrifice their lives. After that, the action finally moved to the school where the main character studied, and unlike that pretentious academy for the rich, it was an ordinary school. The young man was running across the road, desperate to get to his first class, when he was called out once again, this time by a janitor in an orange uniform. Grinning good-naturedly, this mustachioed man admitted that he had recently quarreled with the boss and was fired. But now the hero can take his place and earn some money. The protagonist now had hundreds of millions and even billions at his disposal, but he smiled happily in response and promised that he would definitely come back after school. The adult, adjusting his now former work cap, added that this is a first-class opportunity for impoverished students. You need to grab it with all your limbs. And then he blinked and the teenager wasn't there. It was as if he'd fallen into the ground, and only an expensive car stopped nearby. Folding his hands and pursing his lips in displeasure, Lin demanded that the owner of the car quickly say what he wanted, because he still had to go to school and beg for a day off. A rather smiling Wei reported that the Dragon Dojo had started to descend into poverty and sell its valuables, and they took advantage of this to buy that academy. Now she is at the full disposal of the main character. He is her unlimited master and lord. But Yuan only responded to this news with an indifferent mooing. Oh, and they also took advantage of Kamostvo and bribes to push the main character's father to the post of the new director instead of Wang, justifying everything by raising a brilliant daughter. The protagonist was used to a lot of things and was not surprised by almost anything. But right now, he was very surprised. Not understanding how his old man rose from a nameless worker to a director, realizing that the patron and host wasn't enjoying himself as much as planned, the blonde got scared and started mumbling that he might have misunderstood his wishes because of the rush to leave. Sighing wearily and lowering his head, the young man ordered just to forget about it. Now he is not up to it, and then he can come up with a plausible excuse to remove the annoying father. At the school, he quickly found the office he needed and knocked softly on the door, but they heard him and quickly allowed him to go inside. Slowly turning the handle and opening the door, the protagonist took a step into the office and greeted the teacher with a happy smile. Needless to say, this wasn't some decrepit, wrinkled grandfather or fat witch, but a fan service beauty who adored the protagonist. When she saw a single visible sign of injury in it, she immediately started babbling, demanding to know who had started Lin, and almost offered to blow on the bruise. It's just that very soon she won't be able to protect this pet anymore. She will be transferred to another class, and he needs to make more friends so that they can protect him. The main character bulged his yellow eyes and demanded to know why she was leaving her usual workplace so suddenly. The other teachers said irritably that it was Lin's fault, that he had a fight with Wang Kai, that he went to jail, and that Principal Zhao had fired the woman for trying to help Yuan. Yes, the Wang clan no longer exists, but the headmaster still runs this school and rules it like a god. And the protagonist is a fool for crossing the road of Kai. The girl hissed irritably at them for saying such evil things to an innocent child, and then tried to lie that it was all a lie. She just found another job. The main character made a pompous and scary face and menacingly promised that if Mrs. Mentor does not want to leave her old position, no one will ever expel her. The other tutors burst into scornful laughter. A penniless student, a nameless flea, and lo and behold, dares to challenge the decision of a noble and rich director and his administration. When asked what he was going to do about it, how to fight and argue, the young cultivator just hissed that he would fire anyone who dared to offend his friend. He actually fired everyone. And then, after some time and in another place, they started to wake him up. Otherwise, the senior sister would get so angry that it wouldn't leave a wet spot on him. Yawning wildly, Yuan confessed that he had been helping Sister Lu in the store until late at night. But since he was woken up, thank you. Now it's better to go to training as soon as possible. As they walked, the second disciple mentioned that senior sister by herself could have reached the next level long ago, but she had delayed her development for the sake of the younger brothers. She also bought artifacts for the Thunder Temple. And so, despite her disgusting, quarrelsome nature, all the inhabitants of this area at the Ninth Abyss held her in reverence. A large crowd of teenagers had already gathered inside, and they were very patiently listening to some girl say that they were just a bunch of stupid morons. This was the designated sister. Her name was Mu Rongan, and she passionately described how deadly Abyss was, and that only a cruel death awaits such slobs there. This was especially true for those who didn't have decent energy reserves and only sold their bodies, such as in the case of a certain Lin Yuan, whom she was staring at intently. They all need to guard their lives carefully, don't they, dear protagonist? And the young man, realizing that he was the one being addressed, shuddered and bulged his yellow eyes. Stomping her foot viciously and clinging as close to the protagonist as possible, Mu hissed that he might have turned Ning's head. But the Abyss creatures didn't care about his eloquence and connections. She hated him, thinking he was just another freeloader and parasite with a bunch of rich friends. But Lin just smiled sweetly and assured her that he would take care of himself. Snorting like an angry horse, Rongan tossed the main character a remote control with a button to use to summon her in case of danger. No, personally, she still didn't give a damn about Yuan's condition. There was no need to think wrongly, just that if he died, Ice Queen Ning's heart would be broken. Just then, numerous government officials led by Wang Mo entered the hall, and they were about to conduct a routine inspection among the residents of this base. The teenagers chirped with delight that this was the youngest official in history, the Deputy Minister of Justice, who had reached such heights for the records in leveling up his level. None of them suspected that this brilliant strategist, the light of the awakened young generation, had long since become nothing more than a dead piece of meat serving the protagonist. Because of this, the main character felt very uncomfortable when Mu, without suspecting anything, scolded him, saying that they were the same age. But Lin was a nameless flea, and Mo was a great hero. She would have fed him her vitriolic sarcasm for a long time. But then, one of the junior employees came up to her and demanded an Abyss pass. All of Rongan's arrogance was taken away, and she pathetically babbled that she just forgot this important document while she was packing. But that doesn't mean anything, does it? The students screamed in horror, because without that damn paper, she and all of them would be disqualified, and her damned feminine lust for beauty would ruin their future. The more senior sister was humiliated, the more Mu began to openly cry and complain that her master would punish her very severely if she wasn't allowed in. However, you might as well be trying to beg a glacier sliding down the mountain not to crush you. Wang only ordered her to get out of sight immediately. Lin Yuan then stepped forward, assuming as grand a pose as possible, and in a gruff voice demanded that the venerable sire make a small exception. Rongan yelled that at least now he didn't get into other people's problems with his pig's snout. If everything worked so easily, then every goldsmith would have become a god long ago. However, the deputy minister didn't react with anger as everyone had hoped. Instead, he humbly bowed his head and said that it was fine. Everyone can go to the Abyss. Both the girl and her charges stared in shock and dropped their jaws, because it would have been easier to believe that cows had learned to fly. Realizing that he was about to be asked for an explanation, the main character rubbed the back of his head innocently and chirped that they seemed to have been lucky. The zombie official, trying not to betray his nature and relationship with Lin, reminded him in a slightly trembling voice that it would be very dangerous inside, so he had to be careful. The youngsters then discussed for a long time the fact that Wang himself, a man with a reputation for being a pompous genius, bowed down to them as if they were equals. This is the miracle of miracles. Shocked, Rongan walked forward, maintaining a deathly silence and not seeing anything in front of her, until she tripped over a cable lying on the floor and fell to the ground. Naturally, it wasn't some pathetic minor character who saved her from this humiliation, but the main one, who gently picked her up like a courtly knight. Blushing furiously like a tsundere, Mu pulled away from him and hissed that it didn't mean anything. And she wasn't Ning, she still didn't give a damn about him. Then she leapt forward and stepped into the elevator, making an incredibly loud and disgruntled snort like an offended horse. Inside the elevator, someone asked them how deep they would have to go, and that they would definitely have to stay there for at least 3 hours. And someone else retorted that everything would be clear on the spot. The Abyss was named for a reason. It was located at such depths that it would be very difficult for most people to imagine its true extent. The young people went down for a very long time, through a colossal system of mechanisms, until finally the system notified that they had arrived. Most of them immediately started whining about how long and boring those 3 hours had been, and only one noticed that Yuan had managed to fall asleep in the corner again. The still puffing Mu demanded to ignore him, so that the elevator would take him as far away from her as possible, and no one dared to disobey, except to comment on the chill of the Abyss. Unfortunately for this red-headed girl, the protagonist woke up on his own and immediately realized that the elevator had stopped moving, and they were at the bottom. Resigned to the fact that she would have to endure his company, the woman reminded him that no one should stray far from her here, one false step and the end. The system's indifferent voice warned that a survival game was about to start to determine who was worthy of the Awakened title. So, let everyone get ready. If there was one thing all survival games had in common, it was its blatant simplicity, and this one was no exception. To win, you just had to stay alive 2 days later. Naturally, no one was going to let the students just sit on a safe platform. In 10 minutes, they would all be thrown out to eat hungry monsters. There were also additional conditions, of course, so the entire abyss was divided into conditional zones. And for staying in each of them for an hour, a different number of points were awarded. Also, each location had a variety of valuable rewards, from serums that give superpowers to mystical artifacts to spur participants on. The main character didn't participate in the dialogue in any way, but he listened carefully to everything the others said and quickly came to the conclusion that he needed to get into the top 10. Mu also kept quiet until one of the students approached her and asked what area she thought their group would be best placed in. Without turning around, she pointedly said indifferently that their mission was to reach the yellow zone before others occupied it, so they would go first. Hearing this, the guys were really horrified, because the designated location was one of the most dangerous, and an ordinary person could not hold out there for a minute. Then Rongin just stood up in a pretentious pose and ordered to carefully hold on to her. She, as befits a cool older sister, will not let anyone offend her wards. The weakling, squishy, whiny, and slob, who was called Yuan, was the first thing to be concerned, and the protagonist, without a trace of resentment, said that he would remember everything and do it. Then a plump, balding, middle-aged man appeared on the platform and introduced himself as an experienced guide who could guide everyone through the abyss for a lot of money. There were surprisingly many applicants, and at least one classmate of the main character also expressed a desire to join the larger crowd. Awakened was generally okay with it, since they would still separate from the rest of the mass of people once they reached the limits of the more dangerous blue zone. An hour later, the guide was still leading the young men and women across the rocky wasteland, bragging that they would not regret their decision and would still be happy with his work. However, the customers themselves were of an alternative opinion. They had been walking for an hour and still hadn't seen a single monster or anything dangerous at all, just wasted their money. The man turned around and readily retorted that the route was so safe because he was leading them away from all the creatures. They didn't pay him $1 million for nothing. And then he suddenly turned to the main character with a question whether he was speaking correctly, while calling him little freeloader to his, and Mu deep shock. And you don't have to make your eyes bulge. It was obvious to everyone who had them. Yuan and Rongin spent the whole way almost close. And as soon as the guy moved even a step away, the woman immediately got mad. The protagonist, having recovered from surprise, calmly smiled. But Awakened almost died of shame. Trying to prove that everything is not so, she just has to protect this weakling. The guide nodded in agreement, but he didn't even try to look like he believed it. On the contrary, he also made a very vulgar joke below the belt about the couple. The funny thing is that others also started to believe it and discuss how this cute brat was lucky. And one woman with a lustful smile offered Yuan her eternal protection. The guide, no longer joking, turned to the group and with a serious face warned them that they would soon enter the blue zone, and there he would not be able to guarantee their safety. He didn't have time to finish the sentence with the warnings, because someone's lightning strike took off his head with the same ease with which people tear plasticine. All those people who were loudly envious of the main character half a minute ago or made vulgar plans for him now bulged their eyes in horror and could not even cry out in shock. Only then did the monster finally appear out of the darkness. It moved on 2 legs and had 2 arms like a human, but it was encased in a shell and had a sharp tail. It was called Headhunter, and in keeping with its name, it was obsessed with collecting people's heads. And if it wanted to take someone's life, it wouldn't stop. The students, who had already believed that the abyss would be an easy ride for them, ran away in a panic. But the same blonde woman who fell in love with Lin stayed. Someone stopped and shouted why she was standing still, and another boy shouted that the blonde was just too scared to move. And while they chatted and cursed and demanded that each other perform some miracle, the demon wasted no time attacking the new prey with its incredibly sharp sting. Even then, the unfortunate girl couldn't bring herself to take even a step. Only thick waterfalls of tears poured out of her eyes. But the tragedy never happened, because a certain object, leaving behind a very familiar purple-pink plume, cut this scorpion tail in 2. This caused everyone to drop their jaws to the ground once again and start wondering aloud who could have accomplished such a feat as the mysterious hero. Lin Yuan, as usual, stood in such a pose as if he was posing in front of a photographer visible only to him to create a beautiful picture for an avatar on social networks. And all the witnesses of this scene, as expected, came to an incredible shock, because some small twink cut the invulnerable tail with 1 card. But Mu was the most shocked of all, because the person she used to wipe her feet on and consider a non-entity suddenly turned out to be completely different. All the while, the headhunter screamed in terrible pain, waving the stump of its tail, from which a real stream of stinking thick green blood flowed. Giving him his trademark evil look, Lin hissed that the severed organ would only be the beginning if the monster didn't come to its senses. His face became even more terrifying when the rescued blonde crept up behind him, clapping her hands, and began to babble and flirt with him in the most disgusting way. Only then did the witnesses realize that there were hundreds of cards on the ground, because it took Yuan 100 attempts to hit the monster in a vulnerable spot. Meanwhile, the girl tried to convince that there is nothing to hang on to this ghoul. He has nothing but a cute doll face. But she considered herself in debt. The main character, trying to keep a straight face, coughed into his fist and gently reminded those around him that luck, in fact, is also a manifestation of strength. The group fell silent again as a whole flock of very familiar humanoid figures appeared on the horizon, their tails swirling behind them. The crowd of schoolchildren and students began to scream again, like frightened chickens. Especially since many dozens of monsters appeared this time, they did not have a chance. After a few seconds, it became clear that they were not even dozens, but hundreds, if not thousands, of scorpion-like creatures from all over the abyss came to snatch a fresh head. They, of all the groups, were the ones who were unlucky enough to run into a colossal pack of bloodthirsty beasts. But someone sensibly asked where they all came from in the safe green zone. Another participant panted in horror that the local animals, in fact, do not care about the borders set by people for people. They will simply be eaten to the bone. Since it was the easiest thing for Lin to say, he was the first to say indifferently that they didn't need to be afraid of some pathetic rats. And now they had to fight their way out before they were caught in a pincer attack. Unfortunately, circumstances were on his side, so Rangan created her signature weapon, a huge sword, and ordered the others to prepare for battle. This wasn't an exercise and no one would give people any mercy, so they prepared to fight to the very end, just like the fear-crazed rats. The beginning of the battle could even be described as beautiful, humans and monsters. Two natural enemies prepared to attack. Unsheathed claws, spikes, daggers, and swords. Mu clearly demonstrated that she did not just earn her status, she cut her opponent in half, and he did not manage to do anything. This greatly encouraged the rest of the fighters, and they realized that the red-haired awakened could truly cut a path for them to escape from an ambush. With each passing moment, the carnage grew more brutal and violent, driven on one side by a relentless thirst for human flesh, and on the other by fear for their own lives. Rangan never tired of waving her huge sword and shouting to her brothers in arms not to despair, just a little more, and they will break out of this ring. However, two guys who had previously regularly communicated with each other, and the main characters noted that the main character is nowhere to be found. He just disappeared in this mess. The blood vessels in Mu's eyes nearly burst with rage, because damn it, this brat was literally right behind them. How could they even lose him? Someone remembered that there was a mutant headhunter that could become invisible. So it was probably this creature that dragged Yuan away while everyone was looking away. Such superbosses are very rare among abyss spawns, but if one of them decided to take advantage of Lin, then all they had to do was say goodbye to him. Of course, this was not the case. The main character was still more alive than all the living, confident in his superiority, and he won his next duel. No amount of invisibility, or whatever else his unfortunate opponent had used, could have protected him from the sharp-edged battle cards, because they leave wounds that bleed. The mutated headhunter was panting heavily and flapping its long, flexible, trident-like tail listlessly, while its body was constantly flashing like a bad effect on TV. No, Yuan won't let this beautiful specimen wait for reinforcements or escape. Let him be obedient, and let himself be turned into another chain dog. The only answer was a long, inarticulate roar, which, however, was easily discernible in despair and a desire to sell their freedom as dearly as possible. But the protagonist was not at all impressed, and he only allowed the monster to try a counterattack in a lazy, cold voice. Completely enraged that some human runt was mistaking him for a toy, the headgunter's leader charged forward like a live torpedo. It strained its entire body in a desperate attempt to tear the little freak to pieces, gouge out its eyes with its claws, rip open its throat with its spikes, and pierce its skull with its tail. But the cultivator himself stood there with such a disdainful calm, as if he was being attacked by monsters blinded by rage every day. This was an ordinary occurrence, and the claw that could have penetrated a tank's armor, shattered a human skull like an old eggshell, didn't even manage to reach the pupil of his eye. More than anything else, the monster would have liked to do this. It was making a tremendous effort, but it simply couldn't move an inch anymore. Some force was preventing it. And then it rose into the air, along with a row of large stones torn out of the ground, as if they were all picked up by some invisible giant who decided to play. Thanks to the improved Silver Spider card, the main character could temporarily use the power of the Awakened level. But soon he will fix this annoying bug. However, this can be done later, and right now he needs to pack this new slave in the most convenient packaging for him. No matter how desperately the poor demon kicked, no matter how much it tossed, its fate was sealed, and in a few seconds it turned into another black card. It would seem that the adventure for the main character will end there. But suddenly he heard a dissatisfied voice reminding him that they should leave while there are no problems. They were 5 top awakened, thugs in black robes with a red emblem, and they were also looking for a mutant, and now they didn't understand why his bright aura just disappeared. They deliberately hid their levels and scared the ordinary headhunters to make them attack the youth and thus lure out the invisible leader. Even the main character, who was used to facing any danger with disdain and a confident smile, hurried to hide, for these goons were no joke. The leader of the hunters shouted, gesturing furiously, that the possession of such a mutant could affect the future of the entire fortress, so it must be found at all costs. He stressed that no matter what the cost, let the other hunters dig the ground with their bare hands like dogs. But they must bring him the right monster on a platter. Lin Yuan heard this while peeking out very cautiously from behind the cliff, and now he knew that hiding from these assassins would not be possible any longer. However, the goddess of fate decided to smile at him once again, and the 5 assassins, instead of scouring the surrounding area, split up into a large area, The teenager took a deep breath with relief, and then wondered what was so special about this mysterious mutant, since such dangerous people would go to such lengths to catch him. To give the main character his due, he didn't even flinch when a dangerous, mocking voice rang out beside him, asking if he was sure of his safety. The entire group of antagonists hovered in the air right in front of him, lit up with an ominous crimson glow, like some wingless angels who had escaped from hell. Their leader coldly explained that he could scan the area, so he was able to spot a certain two-legged, blonde-haired rat hiding behind a rock from the very beginning. Now, they weren't even going to take Yuan prisoner to interrogate him and find out how much he had overheard, so it would be more logical to immediately crush and forget such a worm. Still maintaining a commendable calm, Lin quietly wondered if his fate had just been decided without even asking for his own opinion. One of the hunters sneered that he was just dumb, nameless, and disenfranchised meat, like anyone who wasn't strong enough to start eating others himself. This angered the protagonist so much that he finally released all of his aura, all of that colossal crimson glow, and advised the enemies to check his level now. They almost fell to the ground in shock, because just a second ago he was just an ordinary frail boy, and now he reeked of power all over the area, like awakened. Oh yes, these bastards really hurt his huge and sensitive ego, so he decided to let them take a chance and see the true difference in their levels. They will not have time to draw their own trump cards, so their only chance is to pounce in a pack and finish off this strange freak in a few blows. There were a lot of bad things to say about the main character, but he wasn't ruthless. If it was hard for his new friends to remove the seals from their powers, then he would help them. He decided to remove them all at once, like band-aids from a long drawn-out scratch, and his open palm exuded an incredible half-divine power. All the antagonists, except for their leader, were, no, not torn to pieces. It would be much more appropriate to say that an invisible force cut them into rows of neat cubes. They all screamed in incredible pain as they felt pieces being torn from their bodies, flesh, skin, and bones being torn apart. But they couldn't affect their own execution in any way. The reaction of their leader was extremely predictable. Bulging reddened eyes, pale and sweaty face, teeth clenched to an obvious crunch. As the rain of blood rained down on the ground, Lin Yuan admitted with fake regret that he had overdone it a bit. Along with the seals, he had also broken their bodies. However, the last remaining one was very lucky, because the protagonist was going to ask him certain questions, and if he agreed to cooperate, he could survive. The villain bravely turned around and heroically tried to fly away, bravely shouting at the last that he was so-and-so rich and influential, and would definitely take revenge on the vile kid. He expected to be at the other end of the abyss in a few seconds, and then he would break out to the surface, but instead, he seemed to slow down. Smiling slyly and pressing the edge of the card to his lips, Lin sympathetically chirped that he had hung up the slowing spells. And if they did not want to cooperate with him, then what is it? Now the villain only had to die painfully and humiliatingly, and to do it in the best possible way, the main character released the invisible leader of headhunters from the map. It would seem that the situation was completely inappropriate, but the evil cultivator still considered his death and realized that this was the thing they were looking for. To further mock the enemy and satisfy his sadism, the young killer confirmed that this is the creature they need, and now it has found them. Like that unfortunate guide, this antagonist died because a long chitinous tail tore off his head and did not allow him to finish the sentence to the end. Yuan wasn't at all upset about this outcome because he could still find out all the secrets, but these pieces of meat would be great food for his corpse-fine matriarch. The creature, which looked like a huge red eye with the tentacles of a jellyfish and the wings of a bat, quickly attached itself to the dead and began to draw out their juices. With the composure worthy of the best sociopath, Lin pointed out that the dead had a lot of spiritual power, and they would raise the level of his creature, and now it was time to return to the team. After a few minutes, Rongan, holding the main character in her arms, rushed through the wasteland and frantically shouted that he should never leave her again. Smiling nonchalantly and rubbing his blonde head, Yuan lied that his legs were just numb. He fell down, and therefore fell behind the rest of the group. He is very sorry for that. When Mu simply ordered him to shut up and hold on as tightly as possible so that he could finally escape from the monsters, he obeyed with great pleasure. Even in this situation, there were some people who started to get angry and cry with envy right on the run, cursing their strength for not being able to go to the goddess's arms themselves. Ordinary mortals would have been exhausted long ago, and even an Olympic champion would have been caught up and torn apart. However, these cultivators were all sweating slightly at most. Rongan worked her long, muscular legs like a horse, never slowing her breath for a second, until the protagonist quietly reminded her to let go. The girl's only response was to order him to hang on to her forearms quietly, because something else had appeared right behind them, and she clearly didn't like it. It turned out to be a huge cloud of gas, all inky purple, and just looking at it was enough to make the fugitive's heart skip a dozen beats. In addition to the monsters, there were also anomalies in the abyss that caused people to die, or just mysteriously disappear. And what was chasing them now was clearly one of those things. Mu again ordered her charges to gather their strength and run after her as fast as they could, so that they could leave this sector, although this was already being done perfectly without her. And the main character, who, because of the favoritism of the universe, did not even need to work with his feet, began to carefully consider this new, interesting information. No matter how fast people ran, no matter how desperately they moved their limbs, the cloud of darkness still caught up with them like a tsunami of departing boats. And it really caught up with them. So the survivors just stopped with deathly frightened expressions on their faces and started whispering words of despair and fear. Well, everything indicated that the main character of all people would once again have to take the whole thing into his own fragile hands and help out the others. But then the purple-tinged gloom began to gradually weaken and disappear in one place, revealing figures standing on the horizon. It turned out to be another group in black cloaks with a red emblem, and they were led by Yuan, who addressed Mu with such familiarity as if she were his little sister. As it turned out, it was almost true. This black-haired coxcomb was a cousin of the red-haired awakened, and the young cultivators were happy about him at first. This kid wasn't awakened, but he already had tremendous power and influence. For example, he could use the rarest and most powerful artifacts in his organization. All of this was good and interesting. But Rangan was much more interested in why her stepbrother was here right now. The young man, like two peas of water similar to the late lightning, refused to go into details, and laconically ordered to follow him, because it is dangerous here. But the woman refused, because no matter how harshly and carelessly she treated her students, they were still her sworn younger brothers. It was as if the new antagonist had read the script, because he somehow deduced from those words that Mu only cared about that cute boy. That is, the main character. So he decided to do what any reasonable person would have done, and that was to finish off this vile teenager right now. The protagonist himself didn't need many reasons to kill or injure anyone, but even he was shocked at how badly the bastard's head must be working. Before he could do anything, Rangan stepped forward and indignantly declared that it was her duty to protect her younger sworn brother on the campaign. So let them kill her too. The new antagonist made a very scary face and asked in a low but fiery voice how dare she cross him, and if she had forgotten her place in the family hierarchy. The clans of Asian aristocrats had the strangest traditions, but in the Murong family, everyone except the leader and his successor were just pawns, weak-willed slaves. Roing, sweating profusely, tried to persuade her older sibling to understand and just let them leave the abyss. Then she would willingly, without a murmur, accept any spanking from him. But the girl holding the mystic lantern mockingly asked what right the living toy belonging to their young master had to contradict him. And that spoiled bastard refused to wait for anything. No, the red-haired awakened should drop to her knees right now and punch herself in the face 10 times. Just then, a heart-rending cry of terror and pain rang out from behind him, and the senior Mu clan member turned around in exasperation, clearly intending to scold his minions for the inconvenience. But he was never going to do it again, because the keeper of the magic lantern's head was torn off and then placed in her still-clasped hands. This angered him even more, and the evil namesake of the protagonist ordered, in a literally thunderous voice, an unknown killer to come out of the shadows, show his face. The main character was too weak physically to do something like this, so he used the recently captured headhunter's leader for this execution. At his unspoken command, the monster did not disappear into the shadows immediately, but very pointedly perched on the top of the cliff, stringing the stolen flashlight on its tail. The witnesses were horrified by two things. First, that the monsters could get inside the anomalies, and second, that this was the legendary Invisible Man. Evil Yuan grinned triumphantly, because they had been searching for this thing for a very long time, and sacrificing one life for it was a very cheap price. No, the protagonist was not going to tear off the head of this scoundrel as well. Instead, he gave the new slave a telepathic order to immediately retreat. The headhunter didn't become stubborn, but immediately turned around, galloping away over rocks and crevices like a huge hybrid of kangaroo and grasshopper. The antagonist and his remaining henchmen went in pursuit in the same way, only having time to shout one last time that Rangan herself came home to accept the punishment. Yuan, who is the main character, in turn wondered why only this creature was able to summon inside this dark cloud, and why this family is so hungry for it. The other characters were much more pleased with the fact that the black cloud finally dispersed, which means that they were safely out of trouble. One teenager first started checking the rating of the best participants and happily commented that they were in the top 500, and now they need to enter the number of 300. He was quickly brought down from heaven to earth, pointing out that even their senior sister is only marking time at the beginning of the 400, and they are all even lower in the ranking. As for that evil namesake of the main character, he broke straight into third place, pushing aside almost all the members of a certain limitless clan, except for two. And only one person, aka the main character, was brave enough to approach the dark as a thundercloud Rangan and ask how she was feeling. Without even looking at the so-called pretty boy out of rage and disgust, the woman snarled venomously that, of course, what could be wrong with her at all? What kind of question? And then she gave up and began to openly cry that no matter how hard she tried, no matter how much she tore her veins in exams and competitions, fate itself made her a slave of her own clan. The main character smiled back calmly, with a significant sly twinkle in his eyes, and asked what would change if her cousin died by accident. Meanwhile, the other antagonists were still chasing after the lantern monster, their feet barely touching the ground as they flew like arrows. Mu began to suspect that something was wrong here, because the monster was obviously leading them around in circles. But for what purpose? What could it be planning? All the hunters immediately stopped as soon as they saw the bone-faced beast. This creature was sitting on top of the cliff, looking directly at them and grinning very viciously. Yuan was taken aback for just a second, and then arrogantly asked who knows who if they really thought that one owling monster was enough to scare them. Then this narcissistic bastard started to prepare to attack, but stopped again, sensing with some sixth sense that something was wrong here. He was right again, because the main character set all the white-faced goons that were at his disposal on him. All three beasts were waiting for an opportunity to attack. The villain, of course, did not think to link this unusual behavior with the monster, that puppet boy. Instead, he assumed that something was wrong with the mutant. The headhunter, obeying Lin's nonverbal orders, turned around very pointedly, bared its skull-like snout, and let out a mocking chirp. This confirmed Yuan's suspicions, and he deduced logically that this gang was nothing more than the first squad sent to finish him off. So he used the blood dragon technique on his companion, and the man tried to remind the young master in horror that he had always served him faithfully. In vain, the ruthless noble still sucked the energy, life force, and just blood out of him through blood path, and then loudly said that he would not continue the chase. Anyway, for now, it was much more important for Morong to stay among the top 3 hunters of the competition, so he retreated further away. The stunned, bone-faced beasts could only growl in vain and pound their fists on the rocks because they could not fly, for all their jumping ability. For their master, this was also an unpleasant surprise. Lin was counting on his animals to quickly tear apart another scumbag, and that was all. But then, with a sinister smile, he muttered to himself that in that case, he would just have to do everything so that his namesake would die anyway and fail in the ranking. Junior Mu asked suspiciously what he was mumbling, and the boy who came to his senses with the most innocent smile lied. "You can't get lost. The places are dangerous." Elsewhere, flying monsters that looked like huge, ugly bird toys with thin bodies and perfectly symmetrical round heads found their prey. They were circling like vultures over a group of adventurers, and one of them shouted that surviving here for so long was not an easy task at all, in any form. And now the only thing that remains for each of the members of his group is just to be as strong as possible, not to sell their lives cheap. After some time, it turned out that they had defeated the monsters, but at a very heavy cost. Half of the people were dead, and it was suicide to stay in the yellow zone any longer. Another person argued that their survival already made them heroes, and they only had to hold out for 3 more minutes before the penultimate rating was published. And then they would leave. Then they began to discuss what had become of Yuan, who, as it turned out, had become separated from everyone, even Rongyin, and no one doubted that he had either died or run away. Finally, the cherished 3 minutes were up, and one student eagerly activated the interface of his wrist computer to check the list. First of all, of course, he decided to test himself, and was very pleased to find that he had reached 300 of the best hunters and warriors in the abyss. Their dear senior sister, as everyone thought, added her name to the gold category of the best 50. But the fact that her cousin fell all the way to the 17th place was a shock. As it turned out, he was being chased by monsters. And not for the first time, no matter where he went, no matter what zone he visited, whole armies of creatures came out and attacked him. But no one was going to sympathize with him because of the loss of points anyway. Even the top 20 is walking diamonds, and only true luminaries can enter the top 10. They had reached the very first page, where the top 10 were listed, and a small oddity quickly caught their attention. Somehow, it was probably because of the gods of fate's sick sense of humor that Lin Yuan was ranked 9th out of all possible candidates. But even that was not enough. This walking doll for women's pleasures somehow still managed to get into the black zone, the most dangerous of all, and was still alive. They all just refused to believe it. Because hell, it would have been easier to believe that a walking skeleton, skin and bones, could lift a ton with one finger. Elsewhere, Mu Rongan was as awesome as they were, even though she was sitting astride the cooling corpse of a huge, bone-encased monster. And her cousin also read the cold, indifferent lines of the virtual interface, and, like a mantra, repeated that some pretty boy had bypassed him. Yes, there was a lot of noise and uproar even in the room of the operators who were watching the exam, because they began to suspect that their system was being abused. However, not everyone was definitely against this development. Yue Wuji, the head of the special squad, was very interested in such a dark horse and wanted to recruit him. A man named He Ao, the head of Thunderclap Hall, to which the protagonist also belonged, growled angrily that this is his man, he raised him, and no one else has rights to him. And Venerable Xing Yuan, the leader of the 9 Heaven Special Class, only cared that this boy was very handsome. Bing Ju, the leader of Penglal Hall, chose to remain silent, but he twirled his thin, elastic mustache very significantly. Meanwhile, the argument between all these important and pompous officials continued with renewed vigor, and Wuji threw out that if Ao wanted to, he would have signed a contract with Lin long ago. The bearded man began to sweat. His eyes started to move, and he tried to answer in a falsely firm voice that it was nonsense. He never doubted this young genius. Xing laughed and reminded that the game is still in the first round stage, but she will still offer the protagonist a contract later. And plus, she likes cute dolls. The men opened their mouths in shock because This type of contract meant unlimited funding and resources, and she was willing to give it to someone just because of her looks. Yue irritably added that his organization would also offer such a contract to the main character. It would belong to them, as if it was about betting on horse races. Hiao, realizing that he had lost even the ghostly remnants of control over the situation, once again tried to remind that this was him. He trained and raised the protagonist. Meanwhile, Lin Yuan himself was doing very well. He and his pack successfully battled the Black Zone monsters. And now, another one of them collapsed as a corpse. Those same contracts were not long in coming. And within half an hour, the main character's email was bursting with messages with tempting prospects. Most people in this situation would have already danced with joy, because this was the best ticket to a bright, poverty-free future. But the hero only called it spam. But he also received the usual letter, from the same amorous blonde girl who was now trying to seduce him to join her and farm points together. All he said was that she must have a lot of money if her so-called daddy could send a bodyguard with her to the exam. As it turned out, she was from a family of tycoons who made a huge fortune selling medicines, and added that her little sister would also be very happy to see Lin. And no, she didn't even hide the fact that she wasn't the heiress of the company and wasn't interested in it at all. She was just a freeloader, burning through money, and wasn't shy about it. She also threw the protagonist a marker showing her location, and a surprisingly friendly, flirtatious argument ensued between them. The main character was even able to appreciate one particularly successful joke in his opinion, and thereby agreed to appear and help her. Elsewhere, the blonde woman giggled shyly, happy that she had managed to catch such a juicy fish on a hook while being led by a bodyguard. In less than 3 seconds, the man she had praised in the letter as great and powerful was being torn to pieces and eaten alive by monsters. The man was shouting frantically for the young lady to run for her life, but her legs felt like lead from fear. Thus, the sacrifice of the unfortunate mercenary was largely in vain, and he left for the next world with the knowledge that the next dish will be his client. But she wasn't exactly a selfish coward, because the first thing she decided to do was warn her new friend not to go anywhere near this place. The young man, meanwhile, walked calmly through the air as if on a huge invisible ladder, and looking at the carnage below, lazily replied that the message was late. This time, he didn't even summon his chain pack because it would be beneath his dignity. He just swooped down and destroyed everything like a meteor falling from the sky. The blonde watched with a slack jaw and huge, bulging eyes, as the vast majority of people would have done in her place. A few of the blind monsters, however, were still alive, and now they were howling and hissing furiously as they turned towards the strange biped that was shooting fire. With the most bored look, as if there were only clingy, irritatingly itchy mosquitoes before, the main character raised a glowing hand. Then he clenched it into a fist, and all the remaining monsters simply burst, as if each of them had been grabbed by a huge giant's hand and crushed to a pulp. When the rain of abyssal spawn's disgusting black blood finally stopped, the girl, more scared than happy, quietly asked if Lin was a god, and Yuan in response just smiled very sweetly and innocently and chirped that he was just a gigolo, a beautiful live doll, and wanted to sit on the neck of some rich beauty. All participants in the competition received a notification that the top 10 user rating was updated, and they hurried to check what happened in it. The protagonist's name took off very abruptly, jumping over the 8th contestant and taking 7th place, and the woman felt very ashamed at the thought that she had ruined something. The main character indifferently waved his hand and said that she would be able to pay for this mistake with money, but the girl wanted a different outcome of events. That's when the main character coughed violently with a stupid expression on his face and just said that you don't need to talk about it now. Otherwise, Abyss is becoming more violent and dangerous. To prevent the blonde from becoming someone's food on the way, Lin decided to take her to a safe place on his own. But she asked what would happen to him then. But then she realized that this is not a living deity, but just Alphonse. Yes, does not need any protection, and only whispered that Yuan would definitely find her later. And the young man did not even think to refuse. On the contrary, he certainly, without any reminders, planned to do it, because such a thick money bag cannot be found anywhere. After a certain number of minutes, the cultivator just sat on the rock like a motionless statue while a drone carrying some sort of metal square flew over him. Through him, the administrators informed Yuan that as a reward for reaching the 7th place in the overall ranking, he receives many powerful artifacts and gifts. Of course, the young man was very happy about this. And now he was determined to raise his personal, independent of any monsters, power level from 6th to 9th. He decided to apply everything at once, use all the things available to finish the procedure as soon as possible, and complete not just one, but a triple breakthrough of spiritual power. When he opened his eyes, his already golden eyes glowed like small lanterns, and he was no more than one step away from reaching the awakening state. He also summoned a demonic spider to use a magic stone on her and use it to permanently fix her to a higher level of power. Now he could use it as many times as he wanted, and now all he had to do was enter the chaos zone and capture the target monster before completing the mission. The administration warned that Abyss is now too dangerous and abnormal for everyone, and any participants should leave. But the main character still decided to take the risk. Rangan was of the same opinion, but for very different reasons. She simply did not want to humiliate herself in front of her bastard family again, and would rather die. And then her beloved older half-brother descended from the sky in front of the main character and in a menacing voice promised to show him, a mangy dog, where he belonged. The main character felt as if he was being targeted by someone, and it wasn't an exaggeration, because an ominous red circle formed around his head. The flashback was set 3 months ago, when Ning Xuan summoned Mu Rong in for some important conversation at the top of a very tall building. The red-haired girl was extremely surprised, because awakened with a blindfold on her face had never asked anyone for anything, and now suddenly turned to her. She cautiously asked the Ice Queen if it was really important, and she, in turn, admitted that in 3 months she would be busy fighting in the abyss. As such, she won't be able to keep an eye on her named little brother, Lin Yuan, and would really like Mu to temporarily take on this noble burden. The younger awakened was so shocked that she blurted out emotionally, as if everyone says that the main character is just a freeloader, accepted to study for beauty. Is this really true? And then she put on a very sly and vulgar face, and whispered that since he looked weak, he must be making up for it with some completely different talents. Yuan made such a creepy face in response. The red-haired devil hurried to apologize very politely and admitted that the joke was completely unsuccessful. It was better to forget about it. This satisfied the cold-blooded girl, and she cooled down about as quickly as she had flared up. Later, Rongan reflected alone that her fate was sealed, and she had no choice. But Ning was not deprived of this privilege, and she decided to contact someone herself. She stood inside the student training center on a raised platform and watched as rows of boys in identical blue uniforms stood like stone statues. Even from this distance and from such an uncomfortable perspective, the main character realized that someone was looking at him very carefully, and he looked back. Blushing slightly, the girl muttered under her breath, not very convincingly, that she would definitely defend this cute young man, but only because she was asked. After that, the action returned to the present moment, and how her older half-brother was flying straight towards the enemy like a living red-hot meteor. The evil namesake of the protagonist released so much radiant energy that he looked like a real comet. And this trail of fire was visible from all over the abyss. A small group of other strong cultivators, each ranked in the top 20, were watching and enthusiastically discussing what might be going on. One young man noticed that Murong had entered a special combat state, which was called Sky Veil. And all this meant a battle with a very strong opponent. But what kind of opponent? Rongan also saw this red light in the sky, and she, unlike other viewers, knew exactly what her cousin was up to. Namely, to turn the main character into ashes. She didn't even doubt that her relative would just turn Lin into fried pieces of flesh. But she was going to fight him because the promise was above the family hierarchy. Meanwhile, Murong finally landed in front of the main character, and a monstrous blast wave like an asteroid shot out from it in all directions. Of course, the main positive character was not afraid for a second. On the contrary, he blinked his golden eyes in a very anticipatory way, as if he was laughing inwardly. It was a stark contrast, with the antagonist blazing and glowing with rage in the truest sense of the word, while the protagonist calmly asked why he had to die. The handsome nobleman happily explained that all the younger members of his family and students are his property, especially Rongjin, and he will kill Lin for seducing her. After looking at him especially closely, positive Yuan asked negative in a still calm voice if he really felt that way about Ma. The villain's face turned stony, and his eyes glowed red as he growled in a demonic voice that the girl had always been and would always be his plaything. Then his face twisted in the craziest way possible, as he howled in a crazy voice that he was going to do something to her, right over Lin's fresh corpse. This completely undermined the cultivator's already fragile cup of patience, so he decided to use his new and strongest move, without foreplay. As with the eyeless monster pack earlier, he very slowly extended his glowing hand, opened it, and then clenched his fingers with terrible force. Such a gesture may not have looked particularly impressive, but it was extremely effective, because the body of the evil Yuan was literally torn into small pieces. While he screamed before dying, not believing what was happening, the main character did not deny himself the pleasure of humiliating him, saying that he did not expect that the aristocrat would die so quickly. Meanwhile, the system sent a message to all the contestants that Murong died in a secret way, and the rest of the people had better not get into trouble. Everyone was incredibly shocked, because not only did a person with such colossal spiritual power die, but also after he further strengthened himself. The organizers of this competition also couldn't find a place to rest from anxiety, and they yelled at each other, trying to figure out how to continue the game after this. These market cries were interrupted by Ao, who asked a very reasonable question: why even they are not able to see the cause of the young man's death, unless they have the appropriate privileges. The zombie Wang Mo lied that it was caused by a temporary technical failure, and he had already sent a team to investigate. But he knew everything very well and despised such a reaction. Rongan desperately tried to make it to the battle site, but she just didn't physically make it, and was greatly surprised to find Murong's mark disappearing from her body due to his demise. And no, she wasn't going to be happy about it because, damn it, her entire world order and purpose in life had been burned out and then thrown out the window. After that, the action shifted to a huge battlefield, littered with giant bones of various monsters, and even the sky above it glowed with lightning. A whole pack of monsters was chopped into small pieces with such contemptuous ease, as if they were actually made of soft butter. Their assassin was Ning Xuan, who despite having no physical vision, fought with a skill worthy of some warrior goddess. When she was alone, she said, as if the main character was also with her, that he was going to have a great chance at the awakening exam. He should not let down. Soon another message came. The anomaly in the abyss was getting bigger and more dangerous, so the test was curtailed, leaving only the collection of monster organs. True, the difficulty of this quest was decided to be turned to the maximum, which is why even elite fighters from the first 24 began to seriously discuss whether to desert. The organizers have already prepared a list of certain monsters, the necessary tripe, and the number of points. And in the first place, with a huge margin, was a certain slaughter angel. The protagonist was a little surprised by this far-fetched coincidence, because he was going to hunt a sinister celestial anyway, and now he has become the main prize. In addition, for millions of points, the winner will be able to claim the most valuable reward from the government, the transition from ordinary awakened to transcendent. The rest of the people continued to argue fiercely, some willing to risk their lives for Kush, and some indignantly demanding to let him go home to safety. Be that as it may, even the most desperate and greedy recognize that Slaughter Angel is a threat of colossal proportions, and the chances of survival even for Awakened are minimal. The administrators added fuel to the fire by making another announcement that you only need to select a target in 3 minutes, because otherwise the choice will be cancelled. The main character, after thinking about everything as carefully as possible, simply shrugged and chose a monster from the very bottom of the rating, because it is enough for him to complete the task formally. As for the monstrous angel, who turned out to be a woman, there were still 4 people who decided to go after her head, 4 incredibly desperate lunatics. It turned out to be 3 guys and 1 woman. All of them had the appearance of experienced, self-aware adventurers, and their names were Huang Ying, Kang Mo, Zhang Shengyin, and Lu Yupeng. They were the most productive and dangerous participants in this tournament, the leaders of the rankings, but everyone else was sure that they were either crazy or scheming. The main character, seeing the current update, instantly changed his mind and decided to try to steal the loot from this 4 while they get to the right place. And, like the people he had previously killed and blamed, Yuan decided to act as dirty as possible, sending bone-faced beasts to attack the competition. Meanwhile, in the new, most dangerous area in the entire abyss, the 3 remaining adventurers respectfully asked Huang what she thought of an alliance to kill the monster. The men admitted that even if the 3 of them joined forces, they would be noticeably weaker than Senior Sister alone. But Angel was too dangerous to attack alone. The red-haired cultivator's only response was to curl her lips in disdain and order them to disappear into the nearest horizon. She was one of the strongest women in the world, the daughter of the Yellow Dragon himself, and she hated the idea of scum asking for her allies. But okay, much more than the hunt itself, she was not worried about anyhow. Who? But Lin Yuan. She needed to find out how he so quickly slipped into the top of the rating and did not allow her to form alliances. Ying must be the first to gain the loyalty of the protagonist in the interests of her organization. And when she took off, she thought that if anything, no one would stand up for this upstart anyway. As the rejected men stared after her, one muttered that he had warned them that they would be sent to hell, and the other muttered that it was still worth a try just in case. Stopping in the sky, Huang realized that she could no longer feel the aura of the main character. But this was a small matter. It was still impossible to hide from the dragon for a long time. The hero used the Headhunter card to borrow its undetectable properties, and warned Wang Mo that he was going to make a profit in the resulting chaos. However, he did not think about the fact that in addition to dangerous competitors, his allies might also be looking for him, such as Rongin, who stopped in confusion and blinked. But after realizing that it was only his dear junior sister that Lin was no longer going to call senior, the cultivator removed the disguise himself and went out to talk. The girl was still so shocked by everything that had happened in the last few hours that at first she was choking on words, not knowing what to say at all. And she couldn't think of anything better to do than just collapse to her knees, not even paying attention to the hard stones that hit her joints painfully. And then she started sobbing and screaming loudly, completely unabashed with emotion, thanking the main character for saving her life from turning into a fucking hell. For some reason, the teenager decided to pretend that he wasn't going to save anyone at all, just that her cousin was the first to get into a fight. So Lin swatted him first, but Awakened was so hysterical that she simply didn't care what the circumstances were or who hit whom first. She just kept sobbing and talking. After that, the young man showed uncharacteristic kindness, gently patting her on the head and asking her to just start life anew. No other payment was needed. The gesture made Mu blush so much that if someone were to hold a thermometer to her now, the unfortunate instrument would simply explode into a mercury fountain. Then the main character smiled in a strange way and asked for an even stranger favor. Rongin had to close his eyes and count to 100, and only then open. Naturally, she couldn't think of anything other than a kiss. And in just a few seconds, she managed to come up with a damned scenario for their entire next life. At the same time, in the abyss around them, a veritable apocalypse was raging. Colossal rays of purple flames raining down on the ground, turning entire mountains into rubble. Even the high-level adventurers, who were no strangers to fighting huge or magical monsters, watched with their jaws hanging open. But they weren't completely wrong when they assumed that a higher power was behind it, because the source of the terrible, destroying radiance was Angel. She was in the sky, surrounded by a purple glow, and around her, one by one, huge rays flashed, capturing the people below like searchlights. The 3 remaining adventurers who had volunteered to hunt this monster and were on its trail could now only scream in terror. The divine evil spirit used the rays as a method of teleportation. It captured all mortals and redirected them to itself. And they tried to understand why in a panic. The most obvious theory was that Slaughter Angel had gone into an incredible rage for some reason, but what kind of moron would even risk pissing her off? At some point, the evil celestial who had been floating motionless between the earth and the sky turned around very slowly, burning the space with her scarlet eyes. Needless to say, this mysterious scum was none other than Yuan, who had pressured Mo to arrange just such a trial for everyone. And he not only put a huge number of people who did nothing to harm him in mortal danger, but also abandoned the naive Rongan, who continued to count. When she finally opened her eyes, she blinked and shook her head, wondering where her Prince Charming had gone without the white horse. Fortunately for herself, she decided not to wander the devil knows where in search of this scoundrel, but with a heart fluttering with love, longing, to wish the protagonist to remain strong. Meanwhile, people who just wanted to level up a little and return home with honor were horrified to realize that they were trapped in a deadly trap. Right here and now, none of them were cultivators, grand masters of chi manipulation, monster slayers, or anything else, but only sinners in the merciless court of heaven. No one could do anything about it, run away or defend themselves in any way. Only one African shouted that the creature seemed to have finally begun to act. The angel covered herself with her single huge wing like a blanket, and from it curved rays of golden energy shot out. Even just looking at them was painful. It wasn't just a beautiful special effect, because the already ominous dark purple clouds were filled with raging flames and they began to pour down to the ground. The main character frowned in puzzlement and asked himself whether the evil celestial decided to start purifying now. It also quickly dawned on the other adventurers that if they didn't finish off the monster immediately, it would simply burn them alive like chicks in their shells. The situation was further complicated by the fact that right now, the monster was rapidly evolving, and if nothing was done about it, it would become absolutely invincible. But there was still one good news. The organizers called for the help of 5 leaders of the Great Fortis Gym. So let the young people wait a little. Predictably, this was no consolation, because by the time any of these arrogant officials showed up, they would be nothing but ashes. Only one person perhaps could truly save their lives, and that was the strongest woman of her generation, if not the entire world, the beautiful Huang Ying. Oh, she heard all this perfectly well, because she was watching the execution site closely, and then she repeated the words slowly, about the rescue and so on. Only to add with a smug smile that she didn't give a damn about these pathetic worms, she would rather crush them all first, like worms. The poor people were completely overwhelmed by the realization that even this living goddess wasn't going to lift a finger for them. But who was she looking for? With her eagle gaze fixed forward, Ying demanded in a voice as hard as iron that the main character immediately step forward. The funny thing is, the protagonist wasn't expecting this, so he really bulged his eyes and asked in a slow, stupid voice if they were really addressing him here. Despite the general threat, there was a commotion in the crowd, because no one understood why Huang was interested in this brat, and not those ranked 2nd to 4th. The villainess didn't waste any time explaining, just took out a mystical golden scroll from her back, a contract on behalf of her great father, and ordered Lin to sign it. The witness's eyes popped out because this dragon family, in their arrogance, was seriously trying to offer the protagonist the worst contract of all, Category F. Folding her hands under her bust, Ying disdainfully threw out that Yuan was just a cute doll who was lucky several times. Even such an offer was a luxury for him. And so that the mutt wouldn't start barking for something else, she pointedly warned the guy to think very carefully before answering. But the young man's reaction was beyond all categories because he simply waved his head indifferently and concisely replied that no, he did not agree. Everyone gasped in shock and disbelief, because it couldn't be that the strongest woman in the human tribe couldn't bring someone to their knees. To get the message across, Lin Yuan moved behind Huang in the blink of an eye and, no, he didn't hit her, but slapped her ass with all his might in the most vulgar way, pointedly waving his hand in the air and looking with pleasure at the red imprint left by him on the buttocks. The hero joked that this is the insult. Of course, after this, the antagonist flew into a rage, ignited her fists, and then attacked the protagonist to turn his face into a burnt egg. The main character dodged this attack with disdainful ease and rose into the air, while behind him there was a colossal, like a reduced nuclear explosion. Looking down at his new opponent from the 3rd floor, he couldn't help but tease her with a very vulgar joke about her ass. Naturally, such a proud woman, whom many considered a living deity, this angered much more than, for example, a simple attack could. She braced herself to try to hit again, rip out the bastard's lower jaw and burn his eyes. But Huang just couldn't move. Only the head and all its accompanying organs, such as the mouth and tongue, were still subject to the mistress, and she used them to ask what the hell it was. Lin Yuan, without even turning around, started to ascend to the heavens, but once again made a vulgar joke that it was just his touch that was so pleasant that Huang's body went into ecstasy. He was lying to make her angry, and in fact, he was using the abilities of one of his monsters, a bug that could paralyze its prey with just a touch. The remaining adventurers below began to discuss in awed whispers that this was the first time a man had been found who could mock Ying like this with impunity. As for the villainess, the further she listened to all this, the more blind she became with rage, and the louder she shouted that she would kill the offender at any cost. The young man turned around nonchalantly during the flight and suggested in a gentle voice that if she was so confident in her abilities, then let her try to grab him later. Several people, tearing their vocal cords, shouted at Lin to stop flying up, because that was where the most dangerous area of combat with Slaughter Angel began. In response, the cultivator flew up to the very top like a blue comet, and was several meters taller than the monster wrapped in an impenetrable fire cocoon. There were no flames raging around the teenager, no blue-white sparks trailing from him or anything else, but still, his figure literally screamed about pent-up divine power. But what surprised the audience the most was why the winged monster still didn't try to attack, why Yuan still didn't collapse like a burnt corpse. Naturally, this was all possible thanks to one of his elite cards. The captive headhunter gave you the opportunity to walk through any fire for 3 minutes. Huang, desperate to regain her former greatness, demanded to know what this damn trick was all about, and if the boy thought he could hide there forever. As an answer, he dramatically opened his hands and said in a lazy voice that he wasn't going to hide. On the contrary, an unforgettable show was about to begin before their eyes. The one-winged angel's eyes glowed an ominous crimson as she finally noticed the little man right next to her. She spread her arms wide, and colossal crosses rained down from the sky, as golden and deadly as the meteors she had thrown earlier. The monster used them to lock up the rest of the humans in a makeshift but impenetrable cage, making it impossible for them to escape until she killed Lin. But the main character was unimpressed by this, and with a mocking grin, he pulled out his own map, glowing with living darkness, from his bosom. He was going to play a board game with the heavenly demoness where the pieces would be real people, and even Huang was furious to hear about such callousness. Hearing that they would have to kill each other for the amusement of two all-powerful sadists, the people began to pray to the gods they all knew, while the arena was being torn out of the ground. As it rose to the height of a good skyscraper, two people were engulfed in a supernatural glow, and they were lifted up against their will. Now the two men, standing on this flying piece of land, looked at each other with despair and fear, because only one was destined to survive the battle. One of them quickly lost his nerve, so the red-haired man fell to his knees, begging not to hit him, and the second was not at all eager to kill a stranger. But after a second it became clear that this was just a ruse, that the adventurer who supposedly gave up actually took advantage of the moment and cut his opponent's throat. The audience hooted that it was disgusting and dishonorable, and the killer himself did not enjoy it. But alas, he found himself in a situation where either you eat or they eat you. Unlike most, Huang was very calm, and when the noise of the crowd subsided, she only indifferently asked if it was her turn to go out to fight. After receiving some non-verbal permission from the angel, she teleported away in the blink of an eye, and ended up right behind the main character, just as the main character expected. For a moment, people forgot about the danger that threatened them, and began to discuss with fervor who would eventually prevail, the dark horse or the living goddess of rage and fire. But Ying didn't strike right away, because she was wondering why this son of a wormy pig and a mangy dog didn't run away anymore, knowing how much pain she wanted to cause him. The only reaction the protagonist gave her was a snort of disdain, and her arms were folded across her chest and nothing more. The argument below was getting louder and hotter. If any of the remaining adventurers had any money, they would have started betting on the champions long ago. Flashing her scarlet eyes, the antagonist suggested that Lin choose the method of his death and at least fall to her knees in front of her. Then she will try to kill him a little less painfully. With a small smile on his lips, Yuan repeated those words about how you want to die, and it was immediately obvious from his face how hard he was trying not to laugh. This alone was more than enough to send the already seething woman into a complete frenzy, and she charged, enveloping herself in flames. The ordinary contestants were horrified, because this attack could easily destroy this entire wasteland, and no one even doubted that the main character was finished. At this moment, Huang didn't even look like a human. She had much more in common with some mad fury, a bloodthirsty gargoyle eager to break bones. But when the fatal collision was only seconds away, and the sounds of heartbeats were ringing in his ears like bells, the protagonist simply stretched out his fist. The shockwave was so strong that it simply destroyed the entire arena. The entire universe rumbled like the seafloor when a tsunami started. And the loser, of course, was not the main character, since that was impossible by definition, but a vicious red-haired girl. After that, the audience, with bulging eyes and drooping jaws, began to give out boilerplate phrases about how they can't believe it, that they are blind, and so on. For this, you had to say all the same bounty hunter card, which for a whole day increased Lin Yuan's physical strength to the point that he became invincible. Now that he had dealt with that pesky insect, he decided to tackle the main problem again, the crazed angel. Huang, struggling to get up on her wounded elbows and groaning desperately, croaked that the main character had been hiding his true power for so long. In response, he contemptuously threw her a contract to sell her soul as a slave for 3 years and ordered her to sign it, to which the woman growled that he should just finish her off. The people below were somehow perfectly able to see and hear everything that was going on. and they commented on it as if they were watching an ordinary movie. But, of course, the protagonist just wasn't going to give up on such a strong and precious female. No, he was going to break her willpower and make her his toy. And her choice was simple. Either she agrees to become his thing without the right to decide anything on her own for 3 years, or watching the fight, the angel will kill her in a couple of seconds. Ying simply burst into tears out of desperation. Her pride was completely destroyed and mixed with mud. But she still agreed to put her signature on the paper. Lin wasn't smiling, but his voice just oozed venom, like a bloated necrotic corpse, as he whispered how humiliating it was for a lady like her. Meanwhile, the monster raised its arms in an up-and-down arrow pose, and a miniature, golden-purple sun seemed to light up behind her. Another useful feature of the protagonist's playing cards was that he could share their skills with others, such as an impenetrable disguise. Huang was no longer hysterical, and she didn't move at all, because she was numb from the expectation of the monstrous heat that would leave her nothing but ashes in a few seconds. But then the monster stopped because it lost sight of its prey, and the protagonist hid them both. Flew up and ordered Ying to attack the target in a cold voice. More than anything, she would have liked to rip out the monster's guts and gouge out his eyes, but now her body was rushing into battle of its own accord, and her hands were pulling out a fiery naginata. With just one blow, it created a huge plume of green energy that was powerful enough to truly injure this invulnerable creature. But before the angel's only wing was cut off, she managed to cover herself with a fire shield, and at the same time slap the person so hard that she coughed up blood. Yuan wasn't at all upset that his new toy couldn't handle it, so he threw down another card with the mocking smile of a cat ready to devour a mouse. It entwined the winged female form with thin, thread-like tentacles, like a predatory jellyfish catching a delicious fish. And they quickly began to pulse with energy. It didn't even take 3 seconds before the divine monster simply disappeared from the sky as if it had never existed, and the ominous clouds and other wonders disappeared with it. People started yelling again that they couldn't believe what had happened, that it was unbelievable, and so on. However, they came to the conclusion that this small, cute Alphonse only has some incredible ability to seduce and win the hearts of women, since even Slaughter Angel surrendered to him.